Chapter 599. His voice was filled with resentment and sorrow. It sounded as if he had suffered the greatest pain in the world, or as if he had a very sad story in his heart and was crying alone in the city. Lu Chen heard the voice, and at the same time, he also saw the mist that suddenly floated up. Most of the mist in the world was white, but here, perhaps because of the light of the blood moon in the sky above, the mist below became a faint red airflow, slowly flowing on the roads, houses, and every corner of this mysterious city. From a distance, it looked like a blood-colored stream, quietly spreading. Tu took a step forward and called out to the thin mist. He looked a little wary, but he didn't seem to be too afraid. Lu Chen's expression was a little solemn. He stared at the red mist that was floating and spreading, and at the same time, listened carefully to the woman's crying voice that floated in this catacomb city. The voice sounded a little erratic, sometimes near and sometimes far, as if separated by a high wall, causing the tone of the voice to change. Therefore, although Lu Chen had some doubts in his heart, he still could not conclude that this voice was the white lotus he was looking for. In addition, Lu Chen also became vigilant in his heart. He had come to this underground city many times. Although the sky was full of red light from the blood moon hanging over his head, and the city was empty, although it looked very strange everywhere, this was the first time such an anomaly had happened. To be precise, it was the first time that the people of Starry Temple had been messing around in this underground city for a long time. No one knew what kind of strange prohibition or formation they had set up in this place. The red mist was slowly approaching, but after listening carefully for a long time, Lu Chen still could not identify the specific source of the sound. After a moment of silence, he gently patted Atsu, who was standing next to him, and whispered, "Can you find the place where the sound came from?" Atsu raised his head to look at the sky, but he did not intend to listen carefully. Instead, he used his nose to sniff the air a few times. After a moment, he seemed to take a hesitant step forward, and then he stopped. He seemed to be carefully distinguishing, and it was rather difficult. Lu Chen did not urge it, but just frowned slightly and looked around. Atsu began to walk and stop, and did not continue to move forward. Instead, it began to circle around the huge statue in the center of the city. It took a few steps forward and sniffed. Just like that, it leisurely circled around the area. Seeing that the red mist was gradually approaching them, and when it was only about 100 feet away from them, Atsu suddenly stopped and walked in a certain direction. Lu Chen raised his head and glanced in that direction. He found that the direction Atsu was walking in was a house that did not look much different from the surrounding. The tall door was open, and it was quiet and empty inside. There was already a little red mist in some corners. There were a few stone steps, and the threshold was above the knees. After walking to the door and looking at the house a few times, Lu Chen once again confirmed that the house here looked almost exactly the same, except for the various sizes that were slightly larger than the normal houses in the human world. So, who would have lived here originally? Obviously, Atsu was not interested in this kind of question. It took a few steps forward, first jumped over the threshold, and ran into the courtyard of the house. Then, it raised its head and sniffed a few times, then stared at the direction of the house's backyard and ran there. Lu Chen followed behind Atsu with a cold expression. He glanced around and could clearly feel the smell of blood drifting from that direction. He snorted, and his eyes slowly lit up with a dark flame. His clothes fluttered even though there was no wind, and he slowly walked over. The woman's crying voice suddenly became louder and clearer, as if it was somewhere in front of him. And in Lu Chen's ears, he seemed to feel that the voice gradually became a little familiar. Even the originally vague crying voice seemed to have a few more words. Although most of it was still a little vague, he could hear a few words clearly. Blood. Acacia. Flower. Lu Chen's face suddenly sank. He remembered that he had heard this song before. It was on a certain night in Kunlun Mountain, when he was still living in the thatched hut on the cliff outside Su Qingjuan's cave residence. White Lotus came late at night, sat on his window sill, shook her feet, looked up at the sky, and softly sang that ballad. Suddenly, the depths of his heart twitched, as if a cold knife had suddenly stabbed into it. The piercing pain was suffocating. Roar. In front of him, Atsu suddenly roared in a low voice, and its voice suddenly carried a violent aura. Almost at the same time, Lu Chen also felt that the smell of blood suddenly became 10 times stronger. His eyes flashed, and almost without thinking, his body suddenly swept forward, like a lightning bolt. A smear of red light suddenly flashed past, like a bloodthirsty beast pouncing over. Lu Chen's body slightly bent, the black fire on his body instantly flourished, directly turned into a black sword edge and slashed over. The wind whistled, incomparably mournful. That blood light in the air was split apart by the black fire, and emitted a terrifying, zzz, sound, and then a miserable cry was heard. A person submerged in blood, even his face could not be seen clearly, staggered backwards, but that terrible black fire, like a demon, did not have the slightest intention of letting him go. It directly bit him, surrounded him, and then violently burned him. Lu Chen landed in the air, his body shook greatly, retreated a few steps back, his face also turned pale. The blood man's power was unusually great, even with his current skills, he could not withstand it, even his chest felt a pain, almost spurting out a mouthful of blood. However, Lu Chen still endured it. He turned his eyes over. Although the bloody man seemed powerful, for some reason, he didn't feel any anger coming from him. Yes, he did not even feel that it was a living person. Blood flowed unceasingly from that blood man's body, like a small river, and looked endless. It was unknown how much blood this person had in his body. A violent aura emanated from his body, but also contained a feeling of weakness and despair. At the same time, the black fire wrapped around the blood man's body. The blood man clearly could not do anything about it. The black fire burned fiercely, and then desperately drilled into the blood man's body. In that instant, Lu Chen thought of many years ago. When he was entangled by the black fire, he was in a desperate situation worse than death, and that indescribable pain. Then, he heard that hoarse howl, as if it came from the deepest part of the soul. Lu Chen took 2 steps back, although the blood man in front of him was abnormally powerful, but at this moment, Lu Chen already felt that this monster seemed to have completely lost consciousness. He turned his head to the side, and then his expression suddenly stiffened. He saw White Lotus. Chapter 600. From the moment he rushed into the backyard from the front yard, he was immediately attacked by this strange blood man. It could be said that it was only at this moment that Lu Chen properly observed the situation around him for the first time. Everywhere he looked, everything was bright red. Perhaps it was the curse of the blood moon in the sky. Wherever the blood light shone, the disaster of blood light was inevitable. And this once peaceful backyard was now completely smeared with blood. The scene was unusually mournful, glaring, and soul-stirring. If a timid ordinary person saw this, it was likely that he would faint on the spot. But Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. He had seen countless terrifying scenes in his life, so he was almost not affected by the mournful scene at all. Instead, he instantly judged that the seemingly messy and cruel blood smeared everywhere in the yard seemed to be a battle formation. Moreover, it was somewhat familiar, as if he had seen it somewhere before. Then he saw that in the midst of the blood formation, somewhere in the backyard, there seemed to be a place that looked like a well. Of course, at this moment, the well was almost completely covered in blood. But at the edge of the well, in the dripping blood, at this moment, sat a person. She looked petite, and her body was also covered in blood. But unlike the blood man, her head was exposed, and very strangely, it was not stained with any blood. The area below her neck seemed to be smeared with a layer of blood. Her face was that of a white lotus. At a glance, she looked like a young girl wearing a bright red dress. At this moment, she sat in a pool of blood with her eyes closed. Her brows were also furrowed, and there was a faint expression of pain on her face. From time to time, her face would twitch, but for some reason, she did not say a word, as if she was forcibly enduring it. Lu Chen was startled. Just as he was about to walk forward, his heart suddenly moved. Suddenly, a thought seemed to suddenly flash through his mind, but he did not grasp it. He only faintly felt that he seemed to have missed something. The scene in front of him was tragic, terrifying, and strange, but there seemed to be something not quite right. He stood where he was for a moment, and then he saw that in the blood formation that was smeared on the ground, although there were many concealments or messy bloodstains to cover up, the main part was still the blood-feeding, secret technique that he saw White Lotus once set up. White Lotus, who was able to set up such a vicious and sinister array, was certainly not a pushover. However, everything in front of him still made Lu Chen suck in a breath of cold air. Even when he was still in the devil cult, he had never seen an array of such a scale and abnormally strong spiritual power. He realized that he seemed to have underestimated White Lotus. Roar. A roar came from the side, pulling Lu Chen's gaze away from White Lotus. He looked back and saw Atsu standing at the edge of the blood-feeding secret array, roaring at the bloody man who was being burned by the black fire. Lu Chen was a little worried. He took 2 steps towards Atsu. In the hasty battle just now, although the bloody man was in an abnormally strange state and seemed to be unconscious, his strength was unusually strong. It could be said that he was not inferior to an ordinary Yuanying stage Shinran. He was really a very dangerous person. Atsu had now become very powerful, but in the face of such a mysterious and strange enemy, Lu Chen was still a little worried. But soon, Lu Chen discovered that the bloody man did not attack Atsu. Even though Atsu was roaring at him and exuding obvious hostility, the bloody man was swaying his body frantically and shouting in a messy voice. The black fire was burning on his body. Was he blinded by the terrible pain? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and called out to Atsu. Atsu turned his head and looked at him, then gave up the confrontation with the bloody man and ran over. However, his eyes still looked back at the bloody man from time to time. Obviously, he was very vigilant against this great enemy. The bloody man did not respond to the actions of Lu Chen and Atsu. His voice was slowly fading away, and his body was half limp, as if he was kneeling on the ground. Lu Chen frowned and looked at the extremely strange bloody man. The wind with a strong smell of blood blew through the underground cave with some whimpers, as if it was a sad cry from ancient times. Lu Chen turned around and strode towards White Lotus. His footsteps stepped on the bloodstains on the ground, leaving 2 lines of footprints stained with blood. Not long after, he came to White Lotus's side, but when he squatted in front of White Lotus, for a moment, he did not know how to start. This girl's body was covered with blood from the neck down. Lu Chen did not know why, but looking at White Lotus's expression, although there was a bit of pain, her spirit was still passable. Lu Chen whispered to White Lotus twice, but White Lotus did not respond, as if she could not hear him. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then stretched out his hand and gently patted White Lotus's cheek. As expected, White Lotus reacted. Her body suddenly trembled, but for some reason, her eyes still did not open. Instead, her eyelids twitched a few times, and her lips were tightly pursed and trembling, but she still did not open her eyes, nor did she open her mouth to speak. Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. White Lotus's reaction was both good and bad. The good thing was that she seemed to still be conscious and responded to external stimuli. The bad thing was that she seemed to be imprisoned by some strange method, unable to open her eyes, and unable to speak. Atsu walked over with Lu Chen. It was obvious that it did not like the surrounding blood-feeding secret spell formation. It looked left and right with a fierce look in its eyes. Even when it looked up at White Lotus, there was no good look in its eyes. It seemed that if it could, it would probably be very willing to go up and bite this girl's beautiful face. At the same time, it would growl from its mouth from time to time. Lu Chen also ignored Atsu. After a moment of silence, he directly reached out and hugged her, ignoring the layer of blood on White Lotus's body. With a low sound, he carried her directly. However, when his hands came into contact with Bai Lian's body, he suddenly frowned and his expression darkened. The layer of blood was too eye-catching, even Lu Chen's eyes were deceived, or it could be said that he did not notice other parts of White Lotus's body. Until this time, when he carried her, he found that White Lotus was not wearing any clothes. This girl was actually sitting naked in this strange spell formation. Lu Chen's face became a little gloomy. Without much hesitation, he directly reached into his arms. After a moment, a faint light flashed, and there was already a cloak in his hand. Then with a shake of his hand, the cloak unfolded, and directly wrapped White Lotus in it. Then he turned his head and took a look, only to see that the bloody person had completely fallen into the pool of blood on the ground under the burning black fire. It was motionless, and it seemed that it was no longer alive. Lu Chen glanced at White Lotus in his arms, only to see that her eyes were still closed, and it seemed that she was still trapped in that inexplicable mysterious enchantment. He did not dare to hesitate anymore, and strode out. He walked all the way to the door of this big house. The moment he was about to step over the threshold, his heart suddenly moved, but he thought of a place that he seemed to have overlooked just now. White Lotus seemed to have been restrained. So just now, that blurry and strange singing voice in the thin mist, who was it that was singing? Chapter 601. Lu Chen stopped in place and looked down at White Lotus in his arms with some confusion. At this moment, her body was wrapped in the cloak, covering the bright red blood on her body. She didn't look so strange and mournful anymore. Perhaps it was because of the warmth in Lu Chen's arms. White Lotus's expression calmed down at this moment. The original pain on her face lessened a lot, and her eyebrows relaxed. She seemed to know that she was safe and had escaped from the sea of suffering and danger. However, her pair of eyes still hadn't opened until now. It seemed that there was still some kind of restriction on her. Lu Chen's heart slightly moved. The hands that were holding her body slightly tightened, and he carefully used his spiritual power to explore her body. Almost at the moment when his spiritual power entered White Lotus's meridians, Lu Chen suddenly felt an incomparably violent spiritual power like a crazy beast rushing over, crushing his spiritual power in an instant. At the same time, Lu Chen clearly felt that this violent spiritual power from the depths of White Lotus's body was also tearing her meridians, and fragmented scars could be seen everywhere. If this continued, there was no need for others to do anything. As long as White Lotus dragged on for a while, her meridians would be broken and she would die without a doubt. Lu Chen was shocked. He didn't think that White Lotus, who didn't seem to have any injuries on the outside, would have her meridians eroded to such an extent. Just what happened when she was missing? Lu Chen didn't dare to delay any longer. Of course, the most important thing was to leave this place and think of a way to save White Lotus. When he stepped out of the door, he looked at the street in front of him. He found that the strange fog that had just appeared had dissipated at some point. Could it be that the strange thing that happened here was related to the strange bloody man just now? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. He wanted to go back and check what was wrong with the bloody man. But at this moment, White Lotus suddenly let out a low moan. Her face showed a painful expression again, and at the same time, blood slowly flowed down from the corner of her mouth. Lu Chen was taken aback. He knew that White Lotus's internal injuries were extremely serious and couldn't be delayed any longer. He could only grit his teeth and immediately ran toward the exit of this underground cave. After running a few steps, Lu Chen suddenly realized that Atsu didn't follow him. It seemed that they still stayed in the big house. He couldn't help but frown. He turned back and shouted at the house, "Atsu, go!" In the backyard of the big house, in the tragic scene that was wrapped in the smell of blood, Atsu was indeed still here. It didn't leave this place with Lu Chen. It was probably because when it was about to leave, it sniffed the air with its nose and seemed to have suddenly sensed something. It slowly walked all the way to the bloody man who had fallen to the ground and was on the verge of death from the black fire, but was still submerged in a pool of blood. It didn't step into the pool of blood. Instead, it stood there about 5 or 6 feet away. There seemed to be some doubt in its eyes. It stared at the bloody man for a long time. It wasn't until Lu Chen's shout came from outside the house that Atu shuddered and seemed to come to his senses. He whimpered a couple of times before turning around and walking out. However, when it was about to leave this courtyard, suddenly, in this already quiet courtyard, amidst the bloody stench and terrifying bloodstains, a low, indistinct, yet seemingly distant singing suddenly sounded. Crescent moon, seeing Albizia, red, for, ya, time passes like water, white hair flutters, towards, the song was intermittent, the pronunciation was unclear, and there were often missing words in the middle. Ordinary people couldn't understand it, let alone a black dog. Atsu looked more and more confused. It looked back at the bloody man, but the bloody man fell to the ground. He didn't get up, nor did he move. His whole body was covered in blood, and it couldn't be seen if this monster was singing or not. Atsu looked left, right, and up and down at the sky. All he saw was a sea of blood, but there was not a shadow of a human. Not even the legendary ghosts who would play tricks in such a tragic scene could be seen. The situation looked a little strange. Atsu took a step back, feeling a little creeped out, feeling a little scared, suddenly barked loudly, as if trying to boost his courage, turned around abruptly and dashed out of the courtyard like a wisp of smoke. A cold wind blew, and the courtyard that was covered in blood finally fell into complete silence. There was a hint of desolation. The smell of blood still permeated the air. The bloody man on the ground was bleeding, and the black fire burned for a long time before it was finally extinguished. After an unknown period of time, there seemed to be a finger-like thing moving slightly on the remains of the body in the pool of blood. When Lu Chen was about to run to the exit of the underground cave, he heard a rush of footsteps behind him. He was very familiar with the pace. After all, it was the dog that had been by his side for so many years. He didn't look back. His hands hugged White Lotus and he walked forward quickly. At the same time, he said, "Why did you stay in that place just now? It was weird, and there might be danger. Remember to follow me closely next time." Atsu responded with a woof. It raised its head and looked at Lu Chen, then looked at White Lotus in his arms. Then, it quickly ran ahead of them. When Lu Chen rushed out of the tunnel with White Lotus in his arms, the guards of the Floating Clouds Department, led by Lu Ting, all came over. However, when they saw Lu Chen's appearance and the person he was carrying in his arms, even though White Lotus's face was covered by the cloak, all of them were instantly dumbfounded. A few of them even cried out involuntarily, "What's going on?" When Lu Chen went down, everyone saw clearly that there was only one person and one dog. There was absolutely no other person. As for White Lotus, although she wasn't a popular person, her identity and status were not to be underestimated. When she was suddenly carried out of the tunnel by Lu Chen, whether she was alive or dead, everyone's first reaction was that they were in trouble. Not to mention anything else, just the fact that White Lotus had somehow managed to sneak into the underground cavern was a dereliction of duty on all of their part. Now, this person looked completely unconscious, and there were even a few drops of blood dripping from the cloak. When the guards saw this, their scalps went numb and their mouths tasted bitter. Lu Ting was dumbstruck. After being pushed by one of his subordinates who reacted quickly, he suddenly came to his senses. He hurriedly ran over to Lu Chen and asked anxiously, "Young master, what's going on?" Lu Chen wasn't in the mood to explain, but he knew Lu Ting's current predicament and worry. He immediately said decisively, "I discovered that White Lotus was heavily injured. This shouldn't be your fault. I'll bring her back to treat her injuries first. I'll explain it to master and your hall mistress Shuang later." Lu Ting's heart immediately relaxed, and the expression on his face also relaxed. He hurriedly waved his hand and said to the people behind him, "Get out of the way, get out of the way. Didn't you hear what young master said? Saving her is more important." But if Lu Chen hadn't taken responsibility just now, Lu Ting probably wouldn't have dared to let White Lotus go. Lu Chen nodded to him and immediately flew off, heading straight for Kunlun Palace. But when he saw the towering eaves of Kunlun Palace, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind, causing him to subconsciously stop in his tracks. White Lotus's internal injuries were strange and incomparably serious. If she was given to true Lord Tianlan to treat her injuries, would he take advantage of this rare opportunity to directly kill her? No matter how he looked at it, this was a great opportunity that no one would be aware of. Even if others were to suspect something, they would probably only suspect Lu Chen himself. Lu Chen frowned and began to hesitate. Chapter 602. Lu Chen was in a dilemma. In the past, his relationship with White Lotus could only be said to be ordinary. Although they had known each other for a long time, they were definitely not close. However, he did not want White Lotus to die inexplicably. Otherwise, why did he have to go to the underground cave and rescue her? However, it was a very difficult choice at the moment. White Lotus looked fine on the outside, but the spiritual power in her body was very violent and abnormal. It was very likely that she would lose control at any time, and this beautiful and talented girl would be blown to pieces. However, could it be that Lord Tianlan also saw that she was so talented and had other thoughts in his heart? After all, she was still the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. That moment was not long, and White Lotus could not afford to delay it. However, in Lu Chen's heart, it seemed to suddenly be tormented by a dilemma for a long time. But in the end, he finally shook his head, sighed, and whispered to himself, "Forget it, anyway, it's not the first time I've been a scapegoat. If I want to be a scapegoat, then let me be." He no longer hesitated, and strode towards the Kunlun temple. Atsu ran behind him, and suddenly its eyes lit up. It saw that under the big pillar outside the Kunlun temple, Oxen was lying there, and seemed to be lazily basking in the sun and dozing off. Atsu barked excitedly, and sped up its pace towards Oxen. Of course, it was different from Lu Chen. It was not worried about White Lotus's injury at all. Probably in the mind of this black dog, even if White Lotus died, it would not be sad at all. If White Lotus woke up at this moment and saw this scene, she would probably be half dead from anger. Earlier at the horse-washing bridge at the foot of the mountain, she had also gotten a lot of demon beast meat to feed this black dog, but it seemed that it was all for nothing. Oxen felt it very quickly. It raised its head and looked over. It saw the black dog running to its side, wagging its tail and growling in a low voice. It seemed very happy. Oxen's attitude towards Atsu was much better now. It swung its tail and let out a moo sound, not sure if it was a greeting or not. However, when it turned to look at Lu Chen, especially when it saw Lu Chen holding the unconscious White Lotus in his arms, Oxen seemed to be stunned for a moment before it stood up. Lu Chen walked to the outside of the hall and looked inside. He did not see Supreme Lord Tianlan in the hall. After frowning, he said to Oxen, "Where's the damn Baldy? I need him to save someone. It's urgent." Oxen hesitated for a moment, turned around and walked into the hall, then all the way to the back hall. Lu Chen looked at its back and thought for a moment. Then, he walked into the hall with White Lotus in his arms. He found a quiet place with no wind and carefully put her down. It was very quiet. Atsu seemed to have stayed outside. It seemed that since the last time they came here, Atsu did not like to enter this hall anymore. That dog was very smart. Lu Chen held White Lotus's palm and calmed his mind. Then, he carefully inserted his spiritual power into White Lotus's body again and began to check on her injuries. The violent spiritual power in White Lotus's body was still extremely fierce, but Lu Chen had learned from the previous mistake. This time, he was very careful to hide in a corner of her meridians, so he persisted a little longer. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he carefully felt the situation in White Lotus's body. Then, his expression became a little strange. The violent spiritual power that suddenly appeared in this girl's body was extremely powerful. Everywhere it passed, it was fierce and violent. Even White Lotus's meridians could not withstand this power. This was the first time Lu Chen had seen such a strange phenomenon in so many years of cultivation. In the past, he had never seen such a strange thing. Because it looked like the spiritual power did not seem to be White Lotus's own spiritual power. With her cultivation realm, her body contained such a powerful spiritual power. It seemed to be very similar to the ancient saying, "A snake swallows an elephant." Lu Chen did not know where this power came from, nor did he know what happened to White Lotus's body. But looking at the injuries in her meridians, she should not be able to hold on for long. Lu Chen quickly pondered in his heart. He thought of all the possible ways he could save her. Finally, he came to a conclusion, and that was, he really seemed to have a way to save her. That was to use the black fire to inject into White Lotus's meridians. Of course, the spiritual power in White Lotus's body was abnormally violent and powerful. It was not suitable to face it head-on. So, Lu Chen would try to burn and slow down this spiritual power from the side. As long as enough time passed, he might be able to slowly grind down this spiritual power. At least, it would not be so violent. But the price of doing this was that White Lotus's meridians would be completely destroyed. Being ravaged by the violent spiritual power and being burned by the black fire, even if she was a genius of the 5 pillars, she would become a useless person. A useless person or a dead person, which ending was better? Perhaps there was no difference. Lu Chen did not know. At this moment, he could not ask White Lotus for her opinion. Fortunately, he did not dwell on this problem for too long. Soon, footsteps were heard in the hall. The footsteps of a man and a cow walked over together. It seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan was resting at the back of the Kunlun Hall today and was invited by oxen. However, probably only oxen could be so direct and unscrupulous. Ordinary disciples never dared to disturb perfected Lord Tianlan when he was resting. Perfected Lord Tianlan, who was wearing a loose robe, strode over with bright eyes. He did not say anything to Lu Chen. He just glanced at him and then swept his gaze over White Lotus, who was lying on the ground. Afterwards, he furrowed his brows and walked over. He crouched down next to White Lotus and first held White Lotus' chin in his hand. He gently shook it left and right as he looked at it. After a moment of silence, he pulled up his cloak. Lu Chen stood aside in silence. Perfected Lord Tianlan pulled up his cloak halfway and suddenly stopped. Obviously, he had seen the situation under the cloak. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. Then, he slowly covered the girl with the cloak again and said in a deep voice, "What happened?" Lu Chen used the simplest and most direct words to tell him about this matter, including the strange and extremely dangerous anomaly in White Lotus's body. Perfected Lord Tianlan's face darkened slightly. He suddenly stretched out his hand. However, he did not hold White Lotus's fingertips like Lu Chen did. Instead, he directly pressed his hand on White Lotus's forehead. At that moment, Lu Chen seemed to hear the air suddenly tense and there was a faint tearing sound of electric currents. However, everything was still quiet. Suddenly, an inexplicable wind blew past perfected Lord Tianlan and lifted a corner of his loose robe. A blue brick under his feet cracked and turned into powder. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression did not change. He pressed his palm on White Lotus's forehead and looked a little cold. After a moment, he said in a low voice, "A snake swallows an elephant." After saying these 3 words, a murderous look suddenly flashed across his face. The murderous look was so obvious that Lu Chen felt it almost instantly. He could even feel that the damn Baldy did not intend to hide it at all. He just revealed it so blatantly. Then, he heard perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly turn to him and ask, "Does White Lotus know the blood food secret method?" Chapter 603. Supreme Tianlan looked at Lu Chen without any strong hostility. That cold murderous intent was not directed at him. Lu Chen could feel this. At the same time, he also understood why Supreme Tianlan would have such an emotion. The blood food secret skill was not a very honorable Taoist skill. Its origin was mysterious. When it was formed was not known, but basically it was thought to be inextricably linked to the evil cult and the ancient witchcraft of the southern wilderness barbarian tribes. Even for a long time, there were people in the human race cultivation world who suspected that this sinister and evil skill might be the result of the cross between these 2 kinds of evil skills. Supreme Tianlan was the leader of the good faction in the world and even had the prestige of being the world's #1 person. He certainly did not have a good impression of this kind of skill that was related to the evil cult. Lu Chen was well aware of this, and he also knew that if he let nature take its course, it might not necessarily be a bad choice. Perhaps he would have done so in the first place. After all, after so many years of tempering, silence and patience had long since become his habit. But in the end, for some reason, he still opened his mouth and said, "She knows the blood food secret skill," but, he paused and then calmly said, I have been in the evil cult for 10 years and almost never seen anyone use this evil skill. I think it should be more related to the barbarian witchcraft of the southern wilderness barbarian. Supreme Tianlan's eyes slightly narrowed. The way he looked at Lu Chen seemed to have changed, but Lu Chen met his gaze and did not have any intention to avoid it. After a while, Supreme Tianlan suddenly sneered and said, "Then you mean, she is actually a southern wilderness barbarian?" "No." Lu Chen immediately shook his head and said, "I don't know how she actually practiced this evil skill, but she is definitely not a barbarian." Supreme Tianlan nodded, looked down at White Lotus and said, "There is actually such a monster in the underground cave. It seems that we need to go and have a look." While speaking, he looked at Lu Chen and lightly said, "Come with me later." "Okay." Lu Chen agreed. Perfected Lord Tianlan kept his hands in his wide sleeves and paced back and forth for a while before suddenly asking, "Although her injuries are strange and dangerous, I should be able to save her." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat, but there was no joy on his face. Instead, his heart sank, but his face was calm as usual, and he only nodded. Indeed, Perfected Lord Tianlan turned around and looked at him with a smile. "Then, do you think I should save her?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, "You asked me to bring her back, and I did it. As for whether or not to save her, I can't make the decision. It's up to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's not save him then. It'll save us some trouble." As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his sleeve and turned around. Just like that, he walked all the way into the rear hall and didn't look back even once. Lu Chen silently watched Perfected Lord Tianlan's back as he left. For a moment, he was also speechless. When that imposing figure disappeared from the hall, he lowered his head to look at White Lotus on the ground. The cloak was still covering her body. Although it covered her originally beautiful body that was now covered in blood, some of the blood still slowly flowed out and dyed the surrounding bricks red. White Lotus was still unconscious. At least her eyes were tightly shut and there was no sign of her waking up. Lu Chen looked at her beautiful face with an unusually complicated expression. After a while, he bent down and hugged the girl's body again. Perhaps because she was pressed against his chest, White Lotus once again felt that familiar warmth. She moved her body and pressed closer to him. Then, Lu Chen heard her seemingly unconsciously murmur a few words. The voice was very vague and indistinct. Lu Chen listened carefully, but White Lotus didn't continue to speak. After waiting for a while, he had to carry her out of the Kunlun Hall. Atsu was still waiting outside the door. When he saw him come out, he quickly ran over. Lu Chen thought for a while and stepped forward. Atsu looked at him with a somewhat strange expression and then looked at White Lotus in his arms. He didn't seem to understand Lu Chen's actions, but he still followed him in the end. Lu Chen carried White Lotus all the way to the room where Su Qingjun used to live. He pushed the door open and put White Lotus on the bed. Then he asked Atsu to stay at the door. Before he closed the door, he said to Atsu, "Don't let anyone else in." Atsu barked and lay at the door. Lu Chen patted its head and then closed the door. The room suddenly became quiet. It was so quiet that it was somewhat lifeless. However, the strong smell of blood from White Lotus's body made this place feel a little different. At least, it was not so rigid. Lu Chen walked to the edge of the bed and silently looked at White Lotus. After a while, he suddenly said, "There's so much blood on you. You've dirted her bed. I'm afraid that when she comes back, she won't use this bed anymore." White Lotus didn't say anything. It seemed that she couldn't hear his words in her coma, or even if she heard it, she couldn't make any response. Lu Chen didn't say anything. He just frowned and sat down on the edge of the bed. After a moment of hesitation, he grabbed one of White Lotus's soft hands and held it tightly. "Tell me, should I take the risk to save you?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. Judging from his expression, it seemed that White Lotus would give him an answer. Moo! Oxen let out a low moan. It chewed the elixir it got from somewhere unhurriedly. Not far from it, Perfected Lord Tianlan walked over. After glancing at it, he said lightly, "I didn't save her." Oxen didn't respond. Perfected Lord Tianlan also didn't say anything. He just put his hands behind his back and looked up at the sky. After a while, he suddenly sneered and said, "A snake swallowing an elephant? She's so young, but she's really ambitious." This time, the green ox paused for a moment and looked up at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand and said, "There's no need to be a busybody. My senior brother's legacy has been severed. There's nothing to feel pity about. Besides, she still has 2 senior brothers on Kunlun Mountain. Although they didn't inherit the snow wind scripture, at least they have the status." After a pause, a trace of dissatisfaction flashed across his eyebrows. He said, "But Lu Chen should know what I'm thinking. Why didn't he just kill this woman in the cave and bring back her corpse?" The green ox snorted and mooed. It turned around, as if it was a little disdainful. After a moment of silence, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly sighed and nodded. "That's right. You and Master always feel that I'm too murderous. Lu Chen is different from me. Perhaps he has his own merits." He seemed to lose interest and turned to leave while shaking his head. However, he had only taken a few steps when he suddenly sensed something and looked up at the sky again. A ray of bright light shone down from the sky. In an instant, the sea of blood and dark clouds that filled the sky dispersed, and the sky became bright again. The terrifying and gloomy phenomenon quickly disappeared, and the sky became clear again. Perfected Lord Tianlan grinned and muttered to himself, Soon. There's only one more time." Chapter 604. His memories were still a bit chaotic. That sudden sense of emptiness still lingered in Lu Chen's heart, making him feel somewhat fearful and uneasy. In fact, if it was a complete emptiness, it would be like sleeping soundly at night, completely unaware of what had happened outside in the dead of night. Of course, there was nothing to be upset about. But in Lu Chen's heart, there was always an inexplicable shadow swaying back and forth in his heart. He tried his best to recall what had happened in that blank period of time, but he just couldn't remember it. Yet there were 1 or 2 jumping-off effects that kept flashing through his mind. He didn't know what the meaning of those inexplicable and strange, or perhaps it could be said that everything was blurry, or perhaps it was all his own hallucinations and overthinking. But in his heart, there was always a voice that he couldn't get rid of. It made his hair stand on end, made him break out in cold sweat, made him continuously search for the past, always returning without any results, but he still couldn't give up. That mournful and angry roar seemed to always echo in his mind. That voice's origins were unfathomable. Perhaps he had never heard these words in his life, but it seemed to be engraved in the deepest part of his heart, never leaving. Those words were like a knife, coldly illuminating the darkest depths of his heart. That voice shouted, "You actually killed even her, N." A low groan, containing a trace of pain, echoed in Lu Chen's ears. Lu Chen's body trembled, and then he woke up from his imagination and endless bewilderment. He shook his head, feeling helpless towards that almost completely blank and blurry memory. His hand was still holding White Lotus's palm. Probably because he had rubbed and carried her several times, the smell of blood on White Lotus's body had already weakened a lot, and the blood that was originally dripping had also gradually dried up, no longer flowing wantonly. Correspondingly, Lu Chen's cloak seemed to be completely dyed red. Lu Chen composed himself, thinking back to that terrifying conjecture he had just made. For some reason, he actually shivered. For a man with a strong will like him, this was quite rare. But when he looked at White Lotus again, he carefully examined White Lotus's face, silently staring. After a long while, he suddenly sighed softly, saying to himself, "It really seems a bit similar." After saying this, he didn't say anything more. He only looked like he had made up his mind, no longer hesitating. His hand that was holding her suddenly clenched tightly, and then he closed his eyes. The room was extremely quiet until suddenly, a low whistling sound could be heard from an unknown place. Then, a gust of wind blew from a corner of the room, blowing up a corner of Bai Lian's cloak. The man sitting next to the young girl had a calm expression, his eyes tightly closed, as if he was concentrating on thinking about something. And on his body, there was suddenly a faint light, and then darkness rose, turning into a dark flame, silently. Everything depends on your own fate, okay? There was a hint of helplessness in his words, but it also made others feel that he was being particularly irresponsible. Perhaps if White Lotus were awake right now, she would probably be seething with anger and give Lu Chen a good scolding. The black flame burned, moving around Lu Chen's body, and then gradually gathered on his right arm, beginning to move closer to White Lotus's soft hand. Outside the room, Black Dog, who was lying on the ground lazily, suddenly felt something. It turned back to look at the closed door of the room. A faint dark flame also flashed in its eyes, but after a while, it buried its head between its front legs, lying on the ground, and yawned. Sometimes, people are so stupid, always looking for trouble for themselves, right? When the sky was completely dark, Atsu was lying on the stone steps outside the door, snoring loudly. The cold night wind blew past, ruffling the shiny black fur on Atsu's body. It didn't seem to care about the cold at all, and it didn't disturb its sweet dream at all. But suddenly, there was a sudden light footstep behind it, and the ears of Atsu, which was still asleep a moment ago, suddenly pricked up, and then its eyes opened. Two cold green lights suddenly appeared in the dark night. The footsteps immediately stopped, but it was already too late. Atsu's entire body was like a taut spring, leaping up in an instant. In the darkness of the night, he was like a deep bow and arrow, flying over in an instant. Accompanied by a terrifying roar, he instantly pounced on the figure that suddenly appeared and threw him to the ground. Then, his snow-white fangs were already on the person's neck. In the next moment, the person's neck was about to be bitten off. Hey, hey, hey. Stop, it's me, old ma, it's me. The person who was pounced on struggled desperately, but then he resisted, because his neck was being bitten by a row of terrifying teeth, and his skin was a little painful, as if it would break and bleed at any moment. Atsu's movement paused for a moment, and after a moment, the dark green light in its eyes gradually faded. It then opened its mouth, took 2 steps back, and returned to the stone steps in front of the door, lying on the ground, and yawned. From the beginning to the end, this dog didn't seem to show any feelings of guilt or embarrassment for biting the wrong person, as if nothing had happened. Old Ma sat up from the ground, touched his thick and short neck with his hand, and couldn't help but curse, and then said to Atsu not far away, "Stupid dog, you almost bit me to death, do you know that?" Atsu glanced at him lazily, and wagged its tail, which seemed to be expressing a very reluctant apology. Old Ma was half to death by this dog, and stood up while cursing, but there was nothing he could do, because behind this dog was Lu Chen. He glanced around, and then looked at the door, and said, "Is Lu Chen inside?" Atsu did not respond. Old Ma wanted to go forward and knock on the door, but Atsu suddenly stood up, stopped him, and stared at him, not letting him go up the stairs. Old Ma was stunned for a moment and frowned. "What is he doing inside? Why don't you let me disturb him? I have something urgent to tell him." Atsu wagged its tail, and didn't say a word, looking like a strong guard. Old Ma was a little helpless, and said to himself, "Have I become stupid? Why do I have to reason with this dog?" Just when he was hesitating whether to leave, suddenly he heard the door behind Atsu squeak, but it was open from the inside, and then the figure of Lu Chen slowly came out. A looming smell of blood floated over with his steps. Old Ma was delighted, and hurriedly greeted him, saying, "You finally came out. Did you hear what I said? Let me tell you." Lu Chen seemed to be a little tired, and gently waved his hand to stop Old Ma. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said to Old Ma with a little determination, "I have to leave." Old Ma was stunned, and for a moment he forgot what he wanted to say, and said, "Where are you going?" "To the barren valley," said Lu Chen. "I have to go there." Chapter 605. Go to the barren valley? Old Ma was taken aback. He hesitated for a while before saying, "Why do you suddenly want to go there?" Lu Chen took 2 steps forward and sat down on the stone steps at the door. Then, he said tiredly, "No reason. I just want to go there and have a look. Come on. Old Ma scoffed at his excuse and retorted rudely, no one on this mountain will believe your words. What's the reason? After saying that, Old Ma seemed to feel that his tone was a little impulsive, so he calmed his tone and sighed. He said to Lu Qin, it's not like you don't know the situation in the Immortal City now. Even if I wanted to slip away, I would be stopped, let alone you. Yes, he was the only personal disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan, the appointed successor of this grand foundation, the person who was the focus of attention on the entire Sky Dragon Mountain and Zhengxianmeng. No matter where Lu Qin went, there would be people watching him openly or secretly, let alone leaving the Immortal City to go to such a remote place like the Barren Valley. Even if he really went to the Barren Valley, he would definitely not be the only person in the valley. There would definitely be many other people who would want to know why he suddenly went to the valley at such a tense moment. Moreover, that incident had happened in the Barren Valley, which would be even more thought-provoking. And in the end, there was still perfected Lord Tianlan standing there. Would he agree to Lu Qin leaving? Lu Qin only felt that his mind was in a mess. This was a situation that he had not been in for many years. It made him feel a little surprised and confused. However, in his mind, those unclear, blurry, and faintly soul-stirring scenes really made him unable to feel at ease. In that lost blank memory, there seemed to be something very important that he had forgotten. Atsu leaned against Lu Chen's feet and accompanied him silently. Old Ma looked at him for a while and finally felt that Lu Chen's reaction was really different from before. He started to worry. He walked to Lu Chen's side and patted him on the shoulder. What happened? Can you tell me? He asked in a low voice. Lu Chen sat in silence for a while before raising his head to look into Old Ma's eyes. He smiled and said, actually, I'm just annoyed and want to go out to relax. But since you came over to talk to me, I feel much better. Old Ma looked at him deeply. After a while, he nodded and said, that's good. By the way, what did you want to tell me just now? I think it's something urgent, Lu Chen said to Old Ma. Oh, that's right. Old Ma seemed to have remembered his mission and forgot all the questions from before. He said, Hall Leader Shuang sent someone to tell you to go to the haunted house immediately. She's waiting for you there. Lu Chen was startled. He showed a trace of surprise and said, why did she go there again? The so-called haunted house was actually the house where Chen He had the accident a few days ago. After the incident, although Fuyunji acted quickly and sealed off the scene, especially the bedroom where the murder took place, there was no such thing as an airtight wall in the world. Very soon, some news and rumors were quietly spread and transmitted secretly in Zhengxianmeng. In fact, the content of the rumors was very simple. It was nothing more than the scene of the murder that took place in the house was extremely horrifying. It didn't seem like something a normal person would do. Of course, those who would kill women and children were definitely not normal people either. However, after a period of time, a very strange rumor suddenly appeared in Zhengxianmeng. It was said that although the house looked fine before, in fact, a long time ago, another murder had taken place. It was very inauspicious. However, many years later, no one knew whether it was forgotten or did not care about this taboo, but the house was given to Chen He and his family to live in. As time went by, many people directly called the house a haunted house. However, there was a hidden meaning in this rumor, and the spearhead was faintly aimed at the people in Fuyunji. Of course, Lu Chen had also heard of this rumor, but he didn't pay much attention to it. At this moment, when he heard what Old Ma said, he frowned. On the other hand, Old Ma's face looked a little solemn. He actually looked around first, then lowered his voice and said to Lu Chen, in a secret place in the house, someone found something. Lu Chen looked at him and said, what thing? Old Ma didn't directly give an answer. He only said, I'm not too sure, but according to the news from Hall Leader Shui, it seems to have something to do with the devil cult. Lu Chen's face suddenly became gloomy. That house was originally for Chen He and his family to live in. Chen He's identity was originally sensitive, and he came here to seek refuge from the devil cult. If they found something related to the devil cult in that house, there would be too many possibilities in it. Did he really seek refuge, or did he have other intentions? There was real evidence, and someone was trying to frame him. Lu Chen only felt that his eyes seemed to be in a mess again. It was hard to see clearly. It seemed that ever since he recalled that vague memory, his mind was always a little confused. He sighed, nodded to Old Ma, and said, "Then let's go there." Old Ma responded. Lu Chen stood up and hesitated for a moment. He looked back at the house, then reached out and closed the door. Then he told Atsu, "You still stay here, don't let anyone else in, understand?" Atsu barked twice, but it seemed to be a little dissatisfied. Lu Chen touched its head and comforted it, saying, "Do me a favor, Old Ma and I will go there for a while, and we will be back soon." Probably the words, "we'll be back soon," made Atsu feel at ease. It quieted down and then lay on the ground. Lu Chen smiled, waved to Old Ma, and walked forward. The road outside was still shrouded in darkness, but when he looked into the distance, Lu Chen suddenly found that on the distant horizon, there seemed to be a faint glimmer of light. He kept walking and gazed into the distance. For a moment, he suddenly thought of something. It had been so many years. It had been so long since the Battle of the Barren Valley. Countless days and nights, countless things, pain, good times, and bad times, but there had never been a memory of that blank period in his mind. But why, this time, he suddenly remembered it. Although it was still vague, he vaguely felt that it was not an illusion. Something must have happened, but he could not remember it. That feeling, it was as if some kind of power had silently sealed that memory in his mind, but he did not know why. Suddenly, the seal was suddenly broken. So what was the reason for this action? What kind of power had suddenly broken the strange seal in his memory? Chapter 606. The haunted house on Mount Tianlong that was gradually becoming famous was located on the side of Fuyunji territory, so it didn't take Lu Chen and Old Ma much time to get there. However, even though Lu Chen was a man with a strong will, he didn't have the perverted hobby of liking bloody scenes. So after the incident here came to an end, he didn't come to the vicinity anymore. Even recalling the scene in that bedroom wasn't a pleasant thing. When they walked outside the haunted house, Lu Chen saw the Fuyunji people guarding around the house. Of course, the number of people was much less than on the night of the murder, but it was enough to stop people with ulterior motives from entering. At this time, the sky was still dark, and the faint light in the distance was slightly brighter. However, the darkness before dawn still seemed to be suppressing the light, making one's heart feel stifled. Seeing Lu Chen and Old Ma walk over, the guard standing at the gate quickly came to welcome them. It seemed like they had already received orders, so they directly let Lu Chen and Old Ma in. They also explained that Hall Master Shua and the others were waiting at the crime scene for young Master Lu's arrival. Lu Chen nodded and walked in with Old Ma. After entering the door of the haunted house, they could clearly feel a sense of coldness. Although the houses and pavilions looked the same as a few days ago, it gave off a lifeless and gloomy feeling. Old Ma couldn't help but frown. He said to Lu Chen in a low voice, "Is there really something strange about this house? It makes people feel a little uncomfortable the moment they enter." Lu Chen glanced at him and said, "Could it be that you're thinking too much?" Old Ma grunted and said, "That's not for sure. After such a terrible thing happened, of course, no one would stay here anymore. Even Chen he had to find another place for him to settle down. This was to prevent him from feeling sad and causing more trouble." As for the haunted house, it had naturally been thoroughly searched by the people of Fuyunji. Even today, they had called Lu Chen over because Blood Warbler and the others seemed to have made a new discovery. However, just like how time would always pass, memories would always be hard to grasp. No matter how ghastly the bloodstains were, no matter how tragic, it would eventually dry up. The thick and horrifying smell of blood in the air had mostly dissipated, leaving only a little bit of the smell, which still reminded people of that horrible scene. Lu Chen inexplicably felt a burst of irritation in his heart, but he still endured it on his face and did not reveal any emotions. Soon, the two of them walked into the backyard and saw Shuang standing in the middle of the courtyard with her hands behind her back, quietly looking up at the sky. In this dark night before dawn, this beautiful woman looked a bit thinner. Although it didn't reduce her charm and elegance, it made people feel that she was vaguely heart-wrenching at this moment. Perhaps she was going to spend the whole night here? Lu Chen and Old Ma walked over. Hearing the sound of footsteps, Shuang turned around. Her gaze swept across Lu Chen and Old Ma's faces, then she nodded slightly as a greeting. There was a hint of alienation in her politeness. Lu Chen asked, "Hall Master Shui, I heard that something was discovered here?" Shuang grunted and said, "Yes, and they suspect that the thing they discovered is related to the Devil Sect. Because you are very familiar with the Devil Sect, they wanted you to come and take a look. I'm sorry to disturb you so late at night." Lu Chen couldn't tell whether Shuaying's apology was real or fake, but since she said so, he could only respond, "It's fine, the matter here is more important." "Then shall we go and take a look?" Shuang nodded and gestured with her hand, then led the way to the bedroom. Lu Chen looked in that direction and frowned slightly, but he didn't hesitate to follow. Old Ma, on the other hand, stood where he was, a little hesitant. But in the end, he sighed and followed the two of them into the bedroom. There were candles and lamplight in the bedroom. It wasn't as dark as it was on the night of the murder, illuminating most of the room. Lu Chen stood at the door and looked around. He could vaguely make out the original layout of this place. It was an ordinary but warm residential room. But now, of course, everything was different. Most of the furniture had fallen to the ground, and even if it wasn't broken, it was stained with blood. Even the floor was covered with dark red stains, big and dirty. The corpses that had once laid here were long gone. Lu Chen suddenly thought of a phrase, "to bury in peace." Unfortunately, his own rationality told him that those poor women and children might not be able to find peace even now. This matter was too big, and the repercussions were too bad. The Floating Clouds office had to investigate this thoroughly. Only then would they be able to give everyone an explanation. More accurately, it was for Shuang to give an explanation to Supreme Tianlan. The corpses of those who had died might still be preserved by Fuyunji, stored in some secret place. As for the wishes of those who had died, or even the wishes of the living like Chen He, everyone could comfort and sympathize, but no one would care. Shuang walked into the depths of the room and stepped over the shocking bloodstains on the ground. She stood beside the large bed that had already tilted to one side, then waved at Lu Chen. Lu Chen walked over, and Shuang pointed at the bed and said in a low voice, "We only found it last night, it's behind there." Lu Chen was startled at first, but then he immediately understood. The subordinates of Fuyunji were used to seeing life and death murders all year round, and they had always been meticulous in their work. After this murder, this haunted house must have been thoroughly searched inside and out. No matter how hidden the corners, or how well hidden the secret rooms, they would all be found by these people, and no one would be spared. So before coming here, Lu Chen was a little puzzled as to why there was a fish that had slipped through the net. The secret was only discovered today, and he was called over. But now that he had a look here, he understood. The floor under the bedboard must have been carefully examined by someone. However, it was probably due to the human mind that the back of the bedboard had been overlooked. It seemed like a very simple trick, but it was able to fool those experienced hands. To be able to set up this kind of setup, one must not be underestimated. Old Ma walked over with a lamp. In the light, Lu Chen grabbed the bed and exerted force, flipping the entire bed over. As he flipped it, his hands actually felt a little strained. The weight of the bed was actually quite heavy, indicating that the wood was very thick and good. In the blink of an eye, the board flipped over, and the lamp fell on the back of the board, illuminating everything and showing a circular pattern in front of them. In the middle of the circle, there was a tall, straight tree connecting the top and bottom. The branches in the middle were forked, and each branch had a layer. Each layer had a different pattern carved on it. There were birds and beasts, Shura demons, humans, immortals, and monsters. The rest of the empty spaces were also carved with many things, looking very strange. The room was very quiet. Shuang watched as Lu Chen squatted down and carefully examined the pattern. After waiting for a while, she asked Lu Chen in a low voice, "This pattern, is it related to the devil cult?" Lu Chen slowly stood up, then turned to look at Shuang. After a moment of silence, his gaze deepened, and he slowly said, "Detain Chen He first." Chapter 607. Why? Shuang stood there without moving. Her expression was a little ugly, but she did not show any signs of anger. In fact, even her tone was a little low. She only said calmly, "No matter what, before I act, you have to give me an explanation. This is the Devil's Sex Tree of God diagram. I believe you are not unfamiliar with it." Lu Chen pointed at the diagram on the back of the bed and said, "In the past battles with the Devil's Sect, you should have seen some similar diagrams. This is because in the Devil's Sect's mythological system, this Tree of God diagram is actually divided into high and low levels. Ordinary disciples draw the lowest level Tree of God diagram, and only the higher-ups of the Devil's Sect understand the meaning of the higher level Tree of God diagram." Lu Chen's finger slowly swept across the branches of the Tree of God. His voice was calm but powerful as he said, "The Devil's Sect's imprint that we usually see is the lowest level Tree of God diagram. There is only a towering Tree of God inside. This Tree of God diagram has the meaning of merging the three realms and all living beings. It is an extremely high-level secret in the Devil's Sect." He paused, then said, "Almost exactly what someone like Chen He, who is second only to one but above tens of thousands of people, would understand. But why would he draw this in his own home? This is the Zhengxiameng headquarters. Is that guy's brain broken?" This time, the one who could not help but ask was not the silent Shuang, but old Ma who was standing at the side. Looking at his stunned face, it was obvious that he could not understand this. Hearing this, Shuang also looked at Lu Chen, obviously also a little puzzled. Lu Chen stood up from the ground, his brows slightly furrowed, as if he was a little hesitant, but in the end he nodded and said, "It's like this, some people in the Devil's Sect, many people, they are actually very firm in their belief in the Devil's Sect's evil path of legend. Chen He is probably such a person." Shui Ying's face looked a little cold as she said, "Then why did he betray the Devil's Sect and rely on us?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "No, he did not betray the Devil's Sect's belief. From the beginning, it was the Devil's Sect's demons who fell into our trap. Elder Ghost ordered to kill his family, so Chen He had no choice but to rebel. What he betrayed was Elder Ghost, not the evil faction's faith, so most probably after he came to our place, he was still anxious and uneasy in his heart, so he quietly carved this picture of the divine tree. Only when he is accompanied by it day and night, he can fall asleep." Even Shuang and Old Ma, these two people who were usually not very close or familiar with each other, involuntarily revealed a startled expression as they exchanged glances. A moment later, Shuang suddenly laughed coldly and said, "Looks like you really know everything about the devil cult. Of Devil's Sect, you did not waste after staying with them for so many years." Lu Chen lowered his gaze slightly. No one knew what he was feeling at the moment, but he didn't explain anything. He just calmly said, "I've said it before. This painting was most likely created by Chen He himself. It's best to capture him first. Does Hall Master Shui have any objections?" As soon as he said this, Shui Ying's expression turned ugly. Just as she was about to say something else, the light in the room suddenly dimmed, and the candles in the room swayed violently. The three people in the room were shocked. They turned around and saw a huge figure standing at the door. He was facing the bedroom and looking at them indifferently. It was true Lord Tianlan. Old Ma was the first to bow, followed by Shuang and Lu Chen. True Lord Tianlan slowly walked into the room. His face was calm and indifferent, as if he was not affected by the bloody and mournful aura. He walked to Lu Chen's side and looked at the Tree of God diagram on the wooden board for a while. Then, he looked at Shuang and asked, "Did Lu Chen's words make sense?" Shuang wanted to say something but hesitated. After a while, she took a light breath and said in a low voice, "It makes sense. Chen He is indeed very suspicious. But this subordinate thinks that drawing this tree of God diagram and killing a family of women and children are two different things. He shouldn't. True Lord Tianlan raised his hand to stop Shuang from speaking. He glanced at Lu Chen and said, "Do you think Chen He is the real culprit?" "No." Lu Chen did not hesitate and immediately answered, "On the night of the incident, old Ma and I saw him at the Tingyu Tower. At least according to the time, he was not here." After a pause, Lu Chen said, "I didn't say he killed his family. I just feel that this person is still thinking about the devil's sect. We can't be careless. It's best to detain him first." True Lord Tianlan nodded indifferently and said to Shuang, "Did you hear that?" Shuang looked down and said, "Yes." True Lord Tianlan said, "Take Chen He first and interrogate him in detail." Shuang responded and turned to leave. After she left, True Lord Tianlan did not say anything more and also turned to walk out of the house. But on the way, he said to Lu Chen, "You come too. Follow me to the underground city." Lu Chen was startled and immediately understood. It seemed that the strange phenomenon in the underground city that he mentioned to True Lord Tianlan was a very important matter to this person. He needed to go check and deal with it immediately. This bald True Lord seemed to attach great importance to the empty and mysterious underground city. Lu Chen agreed and followed him out of the door. Old Ma was a little hesitant and did not know whether he should follow them or not. But then he saw Lu Chen wave his hand slightly when he passed by him, indicating that he did not want him to follow. Old Ma was relieved. At the same time, he was a little curious about what happened in the underground city. After the two people left, Old Ma was left alone in the bedroom. Old Ma could not help but walk to the side of the bed and squat down to take a closer look at the picture of the divine tree. This time, after looking at it for a long time, he gradually frowned and revealed a puzzled expression. It seemed that he saw something that he did not quite understand and was a little puzzled. On the way to the entrance of the underground cave at the foot of the mountain, True Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen walked all the way. To be exact, Lu Chen was always one step behind True Lord Tianlan, walking on his side and behind him. True Lord Tianlan did not say anything about it. After walking for a while and seeing no one around, he suddenly asked Lu Chen, "How is White Lotus?" After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "I helped her to recuperate, but she has not woken up yet. I don't know whether she's alive or not. It all depends on her luck." True Lord Tianlan replied with an, "Oh," and took 2 steps forward, saying, "You seem to be soft-hearted recently." Lu Chen raised his head and glanced at his tall silhouette, not saying a word. True Lord Tianlan also did not say anything about it. The master and disciple seemed to have nothing to say and went down the mountain just like that. However, when they reached the long street, True Lord Tianlan suddenly asked, "You said that the picture of the divine tree was only of an extremely high level. Isn't that the highest level of the divine tree in the devil cult?" Lu Chen said, "Yes." True Lord Tianlan asked, "What does the highest level of the divine tree look like?" Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and then said, "It's a scene of the collapse of the sky and the collapse of the 3 realms. The divine tree runs through the sky and the devil god descends. All living beings prostrate and unite." Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps came to a sudden halt. Chapter 608. Lu Chen saw that Perfected Lord Tianlan stopped but did not turn around. He just looked into the distance. He looked in the direction of Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze and saw that the sun had finally broken through the horizon in the distance. Its warm radiance dyed the sky red, bringing light and hope to the world. "It's daybreak," Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly said. Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, it's daybreak." Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at the rising sun and said, "Do you believe in the words of the devil cult?" "No." Lu Chen said, "If I believed in those nonsense, I wouldn't have done those things in the barren valley." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded slowly and said, "You're right." At that time, the demons of the devil cult were only 1 step away from the true God's descent. So on the matter of the devil cult, even if I don't believe in anyone in the world, I will definitely believe in you. Lu Chen looked at him and Perfected Lord Tianlan turned back, smiled at him and even patted Lu Chen's shoulder. There were some words that they should understand in their hearts, but they wouldn't say it out loud. For people at this level, in a sense, trust was often more important than ability. No matter what one's background, character, ability, or means, trust was the most difficult thing to obtain. Standing at the peak of the human race, deity stage perfected cultivators had seen through the superficial and fickle human affairs and the changes of the world. In the bloody battles with the devil cult over the years, mutual deceit and intrigue had become commonplace. They, who had to be on guard against the weapon stabbing from behind at all times, were the ones who valued and trusted the most. Perhaps it was because of this that Perfected Lord Tianlan had always regarded Lu Chen with special respect. Only he had always believed that no matter how the world changed, only Lu Chen would always stand with him and would never conspire with the devil cult. By the way, Supreme Lord Tianlan turned around and continued to walk forward. At the same time, he said casually, "You've been in the devil cult for so many years. I heard that those evildoers are very good at brainwashing. Why are you still able to stay awake?" Lu Chen followed behind him. After a moment of silence, he said, "You taught me." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him before bursting into laughter. There seemed to be a hint of gratification and joy in his laughter. With the three of us here, moving unhindered throughout the world is a small matter. In this world, there is not a single person who can contend against us. Even that bastard Tianlan has no choice but to lower his head. A slightly complacent voice came from the main hall of the Starry Hall. Of course, such rash and bold words could not be heard by too many people. Therefore, at this moment, there were only 3 people sitting in the Starry Hall. They were the 3 famous perfected lords of the divine transformation realm in Zhengxianmeng. They were the master of the Starry Hall, Perfected Guyu, the master of the Heavenly Law Hall, Perfected Tai Hu, and Perfected Guangbo. The one who was speaking now was Perfected Guangbo. He looked excited and expectant. Obviously, he was very proud of himself for organizing this secret alliance against Perfected Lord Tianlan and the Fuyunji faction. He almost patted his chest and boasted. Compared to Perfected Guangbo's arrogance and complacency, Perfected Guyu and Perfected Tai Hu looked calmer. Among them, Perfected Guyu pondered for a moment and looked at Perfected Tai Hu. Then, he asked, "You really can't persuade Perfected Golden Dragon and Perfected Flowing Cloud?" Immortal Guangbo's expression froze. Immortal Tiehu, who was sitting beside him, continued, "Yes, I've talked to the 2 of them in private. Immortal Golden Dragon said that he's old and probably doesn't have much time left, so he doesn't want to be involved in these matters. Immortal Lu Yun, on the other hand, is trying to comprehend the mystical arts and has been in seclusion for 20 years. He's reached a critical juncture and can't be distracted." Perfected Guyu nodded slowly. Seeing his expression, Perfected Guangbo hurriedly said, "Even so, these 2 perfected immortals have promised in private that they will restrain their subordinates and never get involved in unnecessary things. In fact, with the strength of the 3 of us, we have an overwhelming advantage over Fuyunji. As long as they don't play any tricks and don't side with Tianlan, we will definitely win." Perfected Guyu still looked a little worried. He said in a low voice, "Could it be that these 2 are hesitant and secretly tell this to Tianlan?" Perfected Guangbo frowned and glanced at Perfected Tai Hu. Perfected Tai Hu smiled and said confidently, "I can be sure of this. They won't do that. Based on their temperament, they can easily find an excuse to make it hard to distinguish the truth from the lies. But if there is a conflict, they will most likely sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. After that, we will give them some small benefits and they will naturally leave." Perfected Guyu clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Brother Tai Hu is indeed astute. Everything is under control. Since this is the case, let's do it." Tai Hu smiled and Perfected Guangbo was very happy. He clapped his hands and said, "That's right. When the time comes, we will get rid of those ambitious people and clear up the universe. When the righteous return to peace, it will be a blessing for all people." A blessing for all people. Perfected Guyu silently repeated these words in his heart. He was a little speechless, but he did not show it on his face. He still smiled and applauded Perfected Guangbo's bold words. Then, as if he suddenly thought of something, he frowned and said, "Speaking of which, since we are going to do such a big thing, we should have a name. Since we are an alliance, we should also have a person to take charge of the overall situation, give orders and judge the situation. Only then can we unify the command and achieve great things." As soon as he said this, Perfected Tai Hu and Perfected Guangbo nodded in agreement, but neither of them said anything after that. Guyu True Monarch frowned, and after a while, said to the two, "I think, this alliance can be called Heaven Breaker. As for the responsibility of being the leader, I am willing to be your assistant, and run errands everywhere, I will not shirk." "Very good, very good. Brother Guyu deserves it, you deserve it." The two people opposite him nodded and looked at each other with a smile. But other than that, no one was willing to say a word more. But the meaning in the silence seemed to be obvious. "Choose me. Choose me." These two words seemed to have been engraved in their eyes and written on their faces. Everyone knew that once they were in charge, they would have great power in their hands. The most important thing was that when it was time to divide the profits after the matter was completed, they would definitely get the biggest share. Wasn't this the reason why everyone fought with their lives and even fell out with that madman Tian Lan for the sake of justice in the world? Justice and justice? What was that? Could it be eaten? Could it feed so many people under them? The two looked at Perfected Guyu with smiles on their faces. Obviously, they were waiting for Perfected Guyu to continue speaking and say that name. Even though Perfected Guyu's cultivation was profound, his willpower was firm, and he was mentally prepared, but at this moment, being looked at like this by the two people, he felt his heart numb. After all, they were both spirit-severing perfected cultivators. The consequences of getting angry. Even people of the same level would be afraid of it. He took a deep breath and thought for a while. Then, he showed a trace of embarrassment on his face. After a while, he took a deep breath and said, "In my opinion, the position of the main leader must belong to Brother Tai Hu." Crack. A crisp sound was heard. It was the teacup in Perfected Guangbo's hand that exploded and turned into powder. Chapter 609. The main hall of the Starry Hall was large and spacious. Now that there were only 3 of them, of course, it would not be very lively. Therefore, the sound of the teacup being crushed sounded particularly loud and clear. Even the guards outside the main hall, who were separated by a closed door, were startled and turned to look in this direction. In the main hall, Immortal Guangbo looked a little gloomy. The spilled tea stained his hands and slowly dripped down, but he did not care. As for the other 2 people sitting at the side, Immortal Tiehu seemed to have suddenly become deaf and did not hear anything. He calmly picked up his teacup and took a sip of tea. As for Immortal Guyu, he had a bitter smile on his face and sighed. Although he had already made up his mind, and although he had expected this situation in advance, when faced with the anger of a Huashan perfected cultivator, even if he was not weaker than the other party, the pressure was still very heavy. In this world, no one knew better than the Huashan perfected cultivator how terrifying a great cultivator who had cultivated to this level was. However, when Immortal Guyu thought of this helplessly, he suddenly felt a jolt in his heart and became absent-minded for a moment. It had been many years since a great cultivator who had cultivated to the Huashan realm was killed. Huashan perfected cultivators were known to be extremely difficult to kill. Even old and weak Huashan perfected cultivators could not be underestimated. Therefore, for many years, almost no one had thought of killing a Huashan perfected cultivator, let alone taking action. In that case, when on earth did Tianlan have such a thought in his mind? Immortal Guyu suddenly thought of Hakushin Jinkuan of the Kunlun party who suddenly passed away a few years ago. For a 1,000-year-old sect like the Kunlun party, some things were destined to be hidden forever, and outsiders would never know the truth. However, perfected Lord Guyu quickly recalled the scene at that time. He remembered very clearly that at that time, Perfected Lord Tianlan had left Zhengxiameng ahead of time and returned to Kunlun Mountain. After that, there were several news channels that there was an intense change in the depths of Kunlun Mountain. Even one of the most famous 4 great peaks in the sky and clouds had been destroyed. That was the winter peak where Hakushin Jinkuan's cave was located. All these thoughts flashed through Gu Yu's mind in an instant. He thought about everything that had happened and felt a slight chill in his heart. However, after a short while, he temporarily suppressed those distracting thoughts, and a smile appeared on his face again as he faced the seemingly thorny problem in front of him. Immortal Guangbo looked very angry, annoyed, and furious. He seemed to be about to explode. If that happened, then all their previous plans would be in vain. Immortal Guyu smiled, stood up, and walked to Immortal Guangbo. He casually handed over a soft silk handkerchief for him to wipe his hands and said with a smile, "Brother Guangbo, you have always been calm and composed. This is not like you usually." Immortal Guangbo snorted, but he did not immediately turn hostile. He took the silk handkerchief and began to wipe his hands. The tense atmosphere suddenly relaxed a lot. Immortal Guyu smiled and took another step forward. At this moment, he had his back to Immortal Tiehu and was facing Guangbo. He reached out to clean up the debris on the table. Immortal Guangbo frowned slightly. Although he was very unhappy now, there was no reason for him to let another perfected cultivator of Huashan realm clean up these things in front of him. In any case, Immortal Guyu was not a servant, but a real perfected cultivator of Huashan realm. If he ignored it, it would be a bit insulting and contemptuous. Thus, Immortal Guangbo could only pout and stop Immortal Guyu. He said in a muffled voice, "Why are you collecting these things? Let someone else do it later." However, halfway through his sentence, Perfected Lord Guangbo suddenly saw Perfected Lord Guyu raise her eyebrows and secretly gave him a meaningful look. Immortal Guangbo's heart skipped a beat, but he still stopped Immortal Guyu. Of course, Immortal Guyu could not really do these things, so he stopped and looked up at Immortal Tiehu. He said, "Brother Tiehu, Brother Guangbo, in my opinion, this matter should be settled. After all, even if we succeed in the future, the 3 of us will have the final say on how to split the profits. How about we wait until then?" Immortal Tiehu was the first to nod and said with a smile, "That's a good idea. It's settled then." He then looked at Immortal Guangbo. Immortal Guangbo looked unlucky and had a complicated expression on his face. He seemed to be calculating in his heart and finally came to a conclusion. He let out a long sigh and said, "That's settled then." Immortal Tiehu laughed and looked very proud. Immortal Tianlan and Lu Chen walked to the long street under the light of the morning sun. They looked at the Fuyunji guards who were guarding outside the curtains. Among them, Lu Chen saw the leader, Lu Ting, whom he had noticed the other day. However, at this time, Lu Ting did not seem to have noticed the 2 big shots who were walking over from the distance. He looked dispirited and seemed to be a different person from when he met Lu Chen. Lu Chen felt a little strange, but then he saw that the morale of the guards around Lu Ting was not high. His heart moved and he could roughly guess the reason. These guards seemed to have been on duty for the whole night, but Lu Chen clearly remembered their expressions when he brought White Lotus out. It was impossible to hide this matter in broad daylight. Now that so much time had passed, it was needless to say that the upper echelons of Fuyunji, especially Shuang, must have known about it. He let White Lotus sneak into the underground, and so many people actually did not notice. This was definitely going to cause trouble, but it had not been dealt with yet. However, with Shui Ying's methods, she would definitely make Lu Ting and the others suffer. It was no wonder that Lu Ting and the others were frowning. While he was thinking, Immortal Tianlan had already walked close to the entrance of the underground tunnel. The guards at the outermost area were just about to give him a warning and drive him away when their bodies suddenly shook and their eyes widened in disbelief. After a while, they were so frightened that they jumped up and saluted. Lu Ting, who was at the back, had not reacted yet. He was so preoccupied that he did not even look over. He was so anxious that a guard went over and pushed him hard. Lu Ting staggered and almost fell to the ground. He was furious and was about to curse when Tianlan and Lu Chen's figures suddenly appeared in his sight. Lu Ting shuddered and immediately strode forward. However, he stammered as he looked at perfected Lord Tianlan, a big shot who was usually revered like a god, standing there. His body trembled slightly, but he did not know what to say. At this moment, Lu Chen, who was standing beside Immortal Tianlan, smiled and said to Immortal Tianlan, "Master, this person is called Lu Ting, a guard captain in Fuyunji. He usually does his work well, but he suffered because of oxen a few days ago." If Lu Chen had only mentioned how Lu Ting was capable, perfected Lord Tianlan would probably have nodded his head at most and would not have paid any attention to it. However, perfected Lord Tianlan was a little surprised when he suddenly mentioned the green bull. He took another look at Lu Ting and asked, "What's going on?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "That day, oxen suddenly insisted on going down here and it was difficult for them to guard. You also know oxen's temper, so they suffered a lot. Fortunately, I passed by here later and showed up to take oxen down, otherwise it would have been a lot of trouble." Perfected Lord Tianlan acknowledged and nodded. "Well done." After a pause, he suddenly glanced at Lu Chen and said lightly, "Do a good job in the future. Fuyunji is the fairest place. Those who are capable will definitely be promoted." Lu Ting was overjoyed. His legs turned to jelly and he knelt down. The guards behind him also knelt down and thanked him profusely. Immortal Tianlan did not say much and walked over directly. When Lu Chen followed him, he took a look at Lu Ting and saw that Lu Ting's eyes were filled with gratitude and he nodded heavily at him. Chapter 610. He was not an emperor, but he was better than one. The surrounding people were prostrating before that tall figure with looks of admiration and gratitude on their faces. All of this was because of a simple sentence from perfected Lord Tianlan. He did not even give a solid promise. Just a simple compliment was enough to make these people so agitated. Lu Chen stood beside perfected Lord Tianlan and watched all of this in silence. Then, the two of them walked into the underground tunnel. Lu Ting and the other guards followed in fear and trepidation. They did not even dare to speak to perfected Lord Tianlan and could only ask Lu Chen carefully if he needed their help. Moreover, their faces were filled with anticipation and desire, as if it would be their greatest honor if perfected Lord Tianlan needed their help. It seemed like they were even willing to go through fire and water for him without any hesitation. Lu Chen politely but firmly rejected them. The surrounding guards looked as if it was only natural and agreed repeatedly, respectfully sending the two lords into the underground world. After entering the underground tunnel, the voices behind them disappeared and the surroundings became quiet. Only the footsteps of perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen could be heard. It really felt as if they had suddenly entered another world from the noisy mortal world. After walking for a while, perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly said, "When those people outside were kneeling to us, I noticed that your expression was a little unnatural. What's wrong?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment before saying, "This is the first time so many people have knelt before me. Although they are mainly kneeling to you, I still feel a little strange." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Did they do this when you were in the fiend cult?" Lu Chen thought for a moment before saying, "Basically not. Occasionally, there will be some master and disciple kneeling to each other. However, the fiend cult does not pay attention to such things, so it's very rare." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment before saying, "You should know that I didn't ask them to kneel to me. Those people outside all wanted to kneel on their own, or when someone took the lead, everyone followed suit." Lu Chen nodded. "I understand." After saying that, he paused for a moment before smiling as if he was mocking himself. "Actually, I've also knelt to you before. Speaking of which, I'm not qualified to laugh at them. Those people are all small fries. Humans are born with the mentality of looking up to the strong." Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "Too many people have always admired and looked up to the high and mighty experts, thinking that they are omnipotent. It's as if there's a dazzling brilliance around those experts no matter how you look at them. They've reduced themselves to dust and become ants." He looked at Lu Chen and said, "Do you think I'm right?" He looked at Lu Chen and said, "Do you think what I said makes sense?" Perfected Lord Tianlan replied, "Of course, there will always be some ambitious elites. However, what do you think if I say that most mortals are like that?" Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and patted Lu Chen's shoulder with a gentle expression and gaze. "You're different from them. Don't be like this." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and patted Lu Chen's shoulder with a gentle expression and gaze. "You're different from them. Don't be like this." The red light of the blood moon had become somewhat familiar to Lu Chen. Therefore, when the light landed on him again, he even felt an inexplicable sense of intimacy. Of course, he was soon reminded of the many things that had happened in the underworld, those unpleasant memories, and his good mood was gone at once. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the blood moon in the sky and narrowed his eyes as if he was observing something. After a while, he said to Lu Chen, "Bring me to the place where the accident happened." Lu Chen nodded and led him forward. Although he still hadn't figured out the secret of the underground cave and the strange blood moon in the sky, as well as what exactly Perfected Lord Tianlan wanted to do underground with the Starry Hall, it was obvious that this bald Perfected Lord was very concerned about this place and attached great importance to it. It was not easy to find a place or thing that could make Perfected Lord Tianlan come to check immediately after hearing it. The blood-red light sprinkled on them and their footsteps echoed in the empty street. The walls and doors of the big houses seemed to be stained with blood, giving off an inexplicable sense of mournfulness. Walking in this kind of place really had the illusion of walking in hell, making people feel very uncomfortable. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen didn't show any discomfort on their faces. Perhaps this discomfort was nothing to them. Lu Chen had been paying attention to the surroundings while walking. The strange red mist that had floated in the air earlier was gone now, and so was the smell of blood in the air. There seemed to be no trace of what happened that day, as if it were a dream. Now, he could only go to the courtyard where the incident took place to see if there were any traces left behind. Of course, Lu Chen wouldn't suspect that his eyes were playing tricks on him or that his memory was playing tricks on him. He remembered the scene that day very clearly, including the bloody man who fell to the ground. After walking through the long street, they came to a house near the strange statue in the center of the city. Lu Chen pointed at the door and said to Perfected Lord Tianlan, "I found White Lotus in the backyard inside." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded but didn't enter the house immediately. Instead, he looked at the terrain here first and then suddenly looked back at the huge statue that ran through the whole underground cave not far away. Then, he seemed to frown inadvertently. After a while, he said to Lu Chen, "Let's go in and have a look." Lu Chen agreed and followed him in. A gust of wind blew in from somewhere in the underground city and swept over their heads. Almost at the same time, they smelled the faint smell of blood in the wind. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't notice it at all. With his hands behind his back and his wide robe sleeves fluttering slightly, he walked along the corridor into the backyard. Lu Chen followed him. When they walked into the backyard, a glaring and cruel red color was imprinted in their eyes. It was indeed the place that looked like a shuraba that day. Although the once scarlet blood no longer flowed and most of it had dried up and solidified, the ground, walls, and corners of the yard could still be seen with dark red bloodstains everywhere, revealing a tragic and mournful aura. Lu Chen frowned slightly and glanced at Perfected Lord Tianlan. The Perfected Lord of the Divine Transformation Realm looked calm, as if everything in front of him was no different from ordinary flowers, birds, fishes, insects, or scenery. His eyes swept over everything here calmly. Not long after, they suddenly stopped at a spot in the middle of the yard. Lu Chen followed his gaze and found that there were only a few bloodstains connected together. They looked a little scary, but other than that, there was nothing unusual. But very quickly, Lu Chen seemed to have thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. At this time, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already walked over. When he was about 4 or 5 feet away from that spot, he suddenly waved his sleeves and a gust of wind swept past. The bloodstains on the ground suddenly shattered and scattered in all directions. Then, a strange mark was revealed under the bloodstains. It looked like a human figure that had fallen to the ground. Chapter 6:11. There was only the trace of a human figure in a pool of blood on the ground, but the person who left the trace was not there and had disappeared. Lu Chen looked at the strange thing on the ground with a puzzled expression. He was extremely astonished. He had no idea what kind of technique perfected Lord by Tianlan had used just now. It was actually able to almost completely restore the general outline of the human figure that had fallen to the ground in a pool of blood. Even though it seemed that the ground had been drowned in blood, Lu Chen was not too surprised to accurately find the place where the human figure was, but it was really incredible to be able to restore the trace in a pool of blood. At this moment, the way Lu Chen looked at perfected Lord Tianlan was a little different. Although he had a very high evaluation of this damn Baldy in his heart, he now found that he might have underestimated this person. Were all the perfected lords of the divine transformation realm in the world so terrifying, or was it only this damn Baldy who was a rare genius? Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes stayed on the trace of the human figure in the pool of blood for a moment, and then turned to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen understood what he meant. After thinking for a while and looking at the surrounding terrain, he nodded and said with certainty, "It's here. That bloody man fell in this place." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and turned to look at the backyard full of blood. As his eyes slowly swept across, he suddenly asked Lu Chen, "You said that when you first came here to find White Lotus, you met that bloody man who was covered in blood, but his spiritual power was very strong?" "Yes," Lu Chen said, "at least at the level of Yuanying realm perfected being." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and said, "Then you knocked him down?" Lu Chen's heart suddenly skipped a beat, but he did not hesitate and said, "That person seemed to have lost his mind and was like a walking corpse. He had strength but could not be used, so he was not a strong enemy." Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "You didn't fight him for 300 rounds. Judging from your tone, you probably defeated that strange person in a short time. Even if it was perfected Yuanying who had lost his mind, it would be difficult for him to do that." He nodded and said, "You're even stronger than I imagined. However, I'm a little curious. Just what kind of Dao technique and divine ability did you use to be able to do this?" Lu Chen's heartbeat slowly sped up. He felt as if there were prickles on his back. A shivering feeling flashed through his mind. The tall figure looked like a tall mountain, looking down at him from above. There seemed to be a fork in the road in front of him. He didn't know what the future held, but he subconsciously felt a faint aura of death in front of him. The choice could only be made in an instant. How should he answer? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen with a calm expression. No one could tell what he was thinking at the moment. Perhaps, he was just asking out of curiosity. He did not have to wait for too long because Lu Chen quickly met his gaze. There seemed to be some hesitation in his expression, but in the end, he still said, "It's a secret technique of the Devil Sect." "It's a secret technique of the Devil Sect. I learned it from Yin Shouyang," Lu Chen said. "It's evil and vicious, but very useful." The atmosphere in the courtyard seemed to have cooled down for a moment. No one spoke, and the surroundings were silent. Coupled with the bloodstains all over the ground, it was mournful and tragic. It looked really lifeless, like a ghost town. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at his disciple quietly with a deep gaze. There seemed to be some complicated emotions in his eyes. Lu Chen, on the other hand, stood in front of him, calm and unperturbed, without the slightest hint of fear. After a long while, perfected Lord Tianlan sighed softly and broke the atmosphere that was about to freeze. "Have you thought about the consequences of using such a method?" There was no one else here at that time. The only person, White Lotus, was also restricted, Lu Chen said. "I won't use it when there are outsiders around." Perfected Lord Tianlan still seemed to be a little worried. He frowned and said, "You have many other choices. It would be better if you could completely not use these unorthodox methods. I don't have any stronger methods." Lu Chen looked into his eyes and said, "I thought you should remember that I was still a child when I was sent to the Devil's Sect. You only taught me patience and unwavering faith. I learned most of the techniques in the Devil's Sect. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly stopped talking. He pursed his lips slightly and his gaze became increasingly distant as he stared at Lu Chen. It was as if in that instant, the radiance in his eyes had already penetrated the person's bones and flesh and seen through his heart. Lu Chen, on the other hand, was still standing there. After a while, he flipped his hand, and a black dagger appeared in his hand. It was short, sharp, and carried a cold and icy killing intent. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze fell on the black dagger. Lu Chen said, "I used it to stab Yun Shouyang's back and then destroyed the god-subduing incantation formation." After saying that, he flicked his wrist and the black dagger suddenly flew up. It wasn't fast, but it flew straight towards Supreme Lord Tianlan. However, when it was still around 2 feet away from Perfected Lord Tianlan, the black dagger abruptly paused in mid-air and remained motionless. From the beginning to the end, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look at the black dagger at all. His gaze was always on Lu Chen's face. He was like an unreachable peak with a natural coldness. He did not care about the ants in the world and only cared about the boundless blue sky above his head. Perhaps the only dream and goal of a peak was to chase or even break through that sky. However, the person in front of him was not an ant in his heart. He was his disciple. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen. Although he did not say anything, the invisible pressure was already as heavy as a mountain, making it difficult for Lu Chen to breathe. As time passed, the silence seemed to be increasing the burden and he was gradually unable to bear it. Fortunately, at this moment, Perfected Lord Tianlan broke the silence again. He said to Lu Chen, "The demonic techniques of the Devil's Sect confuse one's Tao heart and harm one's foundation. From now on, don't use them anymore." Lu Chen was slightly relieved. However, before he could truly heave a sigh of relief, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly took a step forward and stretched out a hand, flicking out a finger. Ding! His finger flicked the edge of the black dagger. In an instant, several cracks suddenly appeared on the dark killing weapon and spread wildly. In the blink of an eye, after a muffled sound, the black dagger suddenly turned into countless tiny fragments and fell to the ground, turning into dust. Lu Chen's body shook violently. Suddenly, he let out a muffled groan and a green aura flashed across his face. Then, he suddenly covered his chest with his hand and took 2 steps back. Immediately after, he spat out a mouthful of blood. He seemed to have suffered a heavy injury and almost knelt on the ground. At the same time, Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure appeared beside him like a ghost. He placed a palm on his back and a pure, righteous, and warm power that was like the morning sun surged into Lu Chen's body, suppressing all the evil power that was about to explode in his body. His deep and thick voice echoed in Lu Chen's ears. "It's my negligence. From today on, you will follow me to practice Tao techniques. I will teach you the magical power of the word heaven." Chapter 6:12. Most people in the world would probably be extremely moved and excited when they heard Perfected Lord Tianlan's promise. Lu Chen gritted his teeth with a pained expression on his face. He was enduring the backlash from the destruction of the black sword that he had cultivated with his life. His facial expression did not show any of this. However, his mood was still fluctuating, although not that strong. Since when did he start to distrust this divine transformation stage Perfected Lord who had raised him and taught him to be an adult? Lu Chen clearly remembered that many years ago when he was still young, his trust in this person was extremely firm and his belief in him was indestructible. If not for this, he would not have been able to survive those difficult days in the devil cult. Because during that period of time, apart from the physical fights, it was actually more of a mental torture. A person's trust could be pure, but if there was the slightest suspicion at the beginning, even if it was just a small crack, it would quietly and slowly expand, and one would think of many things that one would not care about or think about in the past. Just like the words he had just said about his teacher's kindness, words that were enough to make one shed tears of gratitude. As Lu Chen endured the pain on his body with a pained expression, he couldn't help but secretly think in a dark corner of his heart, have I really been negligent? Even if he really had countless important things to do and plans for his only personal disciple, would he really neglect to teach his disciple? Or perhaps, in the previous days, he had other plans in mind? Lu Chen felt that at this moment, he suddenly understood what the saying, "people's hearts are unpredictable," meant. This person's mind was too hard to guess, and it was already very difficult for him to trust him unconditionally like before. After a long while, the pain in his body was slowly suppressed. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression relaxed a little, and he withdrew his palm and straightened up. Lu Chen moved his body and felt that the meridians in his body that had been damaged by the backlash had almost been completely repaired. He was secretly a little speechless, so he nodded to Perfected Lord Tianlan and then said after a moment of hesitation, "Thank you." "Thank me for what?" Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him playfully and said, "Are you thanking me for helping you or thanking me for saying that I would teach you Dao skills and mystiques?" Lu Chen said, "I guess so. At least today, I feel like I didn't become your disciple in vain." Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment, and then he suddenly grinned as if he was happy. He even patted Lu Chen on the shoulder and said with a chuckle, "Boy. Live well. You still have a long life ahead of you." "Yeah," Lu Chen nodded and said, "It wasn't easy for me to live to this day. I don't want to die." Perfected Lord Tianlan burst into laughter. The deep laughter seemed to have broken the somber and mournful atmosphere in the courtyard, causing the surrounding colors to become much warmer. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be born with this ability. He could change the world around him with his own strength, instead of going with the flow and adapting to this world. When his gaze returned to the courtyard, it was clear that he had not forgotten the original purpose of his visit. His gaze once again fell on the blood-colored figure on the ground. After sizing it up a few times, he raised his head and looked further into the courtyard. Many places in the spacious courtyard were covered by blood, including the walls, railings, and corners. There was blood everywhere, including the edge of an inconspicuous well at the back of the courtyard. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze swept across the well. After pondering for a moment, he turned to Lu Chen and said, "There's something that I need you to do for me." Lu Chen was a little surprised. He did not expect Perfected Lord Tianlan to suddenly make such a request at this time, but he still said, "What do you need me to do?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Go back to the entrance on the surface now and ask the guards outside to immediately find Shuang using the most urgent method. Then wait there. When you see Shuang, ask her to arrange 100 absolutely trustworthy subordinates to come to the underground city together. I have something urgent that I need them to do." After a pause, Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen meaningfully and said, "If you don't go and tell her, she probably won't believe me." Lu Chen's heart was in turmoil. He was full of doubts, but in the end, he nodded and agreed to it. Then, he turned and walked out of the courtyard. When he walked out of the gate of the residence, he could not help but look back. He could no longer see Perfected Lord Tianlan's tall figure. He did not know why, but he felt that something was not right. What urgent matter could this damn Baldy have? Why did this order give him the feeling that it was deliberately sending him away? Lu Chen frowned. After hesitating for a moment, he shook his head and walked quickly to the entrance on the surface. In the backyard, Perfected Lord Tianlan stood quietly on the spot. He seemed to have waited patiently for quite a while. Even though there was a distance between them and a high wall between them, and he didn't even turn his head, this deity transformation stage true monarch seemed to be able to clearly see Lu Chen's every move, or rather, feel everything. Only when Lu Chen strode far away did he slowly open his eyes. There was a somewhat deep look on his face. Then, he swept his gaze across the courtyard. A gust of wind blew past, his robe fluttered slowly. Suddenly, there seemed to be lightning flashing in the depths of his eyes, suddenly becoming sharp. On the ground that was covered by the pool of blood, on the ground not far from that blood-colored figure, slowly, a footprint appeared. It was a footprint stained with blood. Then, there was a second, a third, one after another. The footprints slowly extended forward until they stopped at the edge of the well. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled somewhat disdainfully. His expression seemed to show that he never cared about anything, even if there might be a great enemy hidden here. He did not even bother to make any preparations to investigate or defend himself. He directly flew up and landed on the dry well, looking down. The bottom of the dry well was gloomy and dark, like a bottomless nest. But he did not hesitate at all. He just sneered and then fell down. If Lu Chen were here, he would probably be amazed that the mouth of the dry well was not big enough to accommodate Tianlan's body at all. But this fat man went straight through it unreasonably and fell into the mouth of the well. The darkness below instantly swarmed up. Then, as if there was a malicious ghost howling in the darkness suddenly boiled up. In an instant, countless strong winds rushed over from all directions. All kinds of terrifying ghost faces, demons, ferocious beasts, and even skeletons and spirits swarmed over, covering the sky and covering the earth. They wanted to tear this person who suddenly broke into pieces. Time seemed to freeze at that moment. It seemed that the most terrifying scene in the world was happening in this dark corner. But the face of perfected Lord Tianlan, who was surrounded by countless terrifying existences in the faint light, did not change at all. He still had that contemptuous and arrogant look on his face. He flicked his sleeves as if he was a little annoyed. A strong wind suddenly rose and suddenly broke the silence. Like a sledgehammer chiseling into solid ice, the scene instantly shattered and collapsed. In the face of absolute and almost terrifying power, all the darkness and fear melted like snow and instantly collapsed. Boom! All the ghost shadows suddenly shattered and turned into fragments that filled the sky. But they could not touch that figure at all. In the whistling sound, his huge body slowly landed on the ground and then looked at the darkness in the dry well. There seemed to be a figure lying in the dark corner in the dim darkness. Chapter 613. There was an ancient religion that once left behind a very widespread saying, all fear and dread is like an illusion, or an illusion. It was hard to say whether this saying was right or wrong, but the wisdom of the sages had been passed down for thousands of years, so there was probably some truth to it. If one cultivated the mind and used one's own heart as the foundation, viewing all things in the world as an illusion, perhaps one would be able to ignore all disturbances and see one's true heart when one cultivated to the highest realm. At that level, regardless of whether one's cultivation was profound or if one numbed oneself, the effect would be about the same. Perfected Lord Tianlan's skills were profound and his knowledge was unfathomable. Of course, he knew a thing or two about this ancient doctrine. However, he had always scoffed at it. Moreover, his cultivation method was the pinnacle of worldly affairs, which was the complete opposite of this school of thought which focused on worldly affairs. He didn't even believe in karma and retribution, believing that everything in the world was under his control. What retribution in the next life? What cycle of reincarnation? In his eyes, all of them were illusions. Only great power was fundamental, and only this life and this world was the only one. Since ancient times, countless legends of gods had been passed down in the human world, but had they ever seen one in thousands of years? Where were the gods, demons, immortals, and Buddhas of the heavens? There was a blue sky above and a thick earth below. No matter how many tragic things happened, they would probably pass quietly like flowing water and floating clouds, not leaving many traces. He stared at the black shadow, his heart suddenly filled with a rare feeling. He put his hands behind his back and looked down at the man. He actually recalled the path he had walked for most of his life. He then smiled, without the slightest bit of regret. The shadow in the darkness trembled slightly, like a person on the verge of death subconsciously twitching. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a calm expression and said, "We meet again." His deep voice echoed in the dark dry well, deep and vaguely carrying a strange power, causing the shadow to tremble again. Then, a strange red light suddenly flashed in the darkness, like the angry eyes of a fierce beast about to bleed. However, perfected Lord Tianlan didn't care about it at all. He seemed to always be high and mighty, and nothing could affect his mind, not even his basic emotions. He even took a few steps forward and stood beside the human silhouette in the darkness. He touched the body of the black figure with his foot. The figure turned over and rolled on the ground. Supreme Lord Tianlan let out a sigh and casually sat down on the ground. He no longer looked at the black shadow but raised his head to look at the sky above the dry well. The red and mournful light of the blood moon flickered above the small well. Looking from here, it seemed that the whole world outside was blood red. Are you going to die? He opened his mouth and said, although this is your original fate, I'm still quite surprised. You've been pestering me with all your might for so many years, yet you've actually fallen into the hands of these young people at such an old age. I'm very surprised. Ah! Roar! In the darkness beside perfected Lord Tianlan, the figure flipped over and seemed to struggle on the ground for a few times, uttering vague sounds that were filled with deep-rooted hatred and anger. His gaze was like a blade in the darkness, filled with vicious curses as he glared at perfected Lord Tianlan. Retracting his gaze, perfected Lord Tianlan turned to look at him. Seems like you've woken up. That's good too. At least you'll know when you die. He smiled and said, I know what you want to say. Do you want to know what's going on with the child I snatched away from you back then? Ah! A low and hoarse howl came from the darkness. It was as if the pain and hatred accumulated over countless years had erupted at this moment. However, this was meaningless to perfected Lord Tianlan. He didn't even bat an eyelid. He looked like a god without any human emotions, looking down at the pain of the people indifferently. He opened his mouth and said, have you been telling yourself all these years that you'll just pretend that you don't have that child? Perhaps one day, I'll directly kill that child? So, as long as you take revenge on me and think of a way to kill me, it'll be considered revenge? The black figure fell silent. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, look, everyone is like this. I can always see through your thoughts. You all think that things will get better and that things might be as you wish. However, you probably understand me a little, don't you? He lowered his head and his voice seemed to have become softer. But in the depths of your heart, is there a voice telling you that I won't do that? How could someone like me do something so superficial? I'll definitely set up a backup plan and teach that child a good lesson. I'll make you suffer the most terrifying pain in the world. That's my way of doing things, right? Roar, roar. A series of roars suddenly rang out. The black figure trembled all over as if he was about to pounce on perfected Lord Tianlan. He was already extremely furious. However, perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, stop pretending. I won't tell you. You'll always have to fantasize like this. Imagine how much pain that child has suffered under my hands. Imagine what kind of hell and torment he might be going through right now. There are countless miserable things in this world. Sorrow, pain, torture, and madness. You can't help but wonder if they'll happen to him. Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice reverberated in the dry well like the judgment of a god. The black figure quietened down. He slowly lowered his head and no longer made a sound. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood up and took a few steps outside. At this moment, the blood moon above his head suddenly lit up. It was as if the light had suddenly become several times brighter. For a moment, the blood-colored light actually shone down on the dry well, dispersing the surrounding darkness. It formed a strange light beam that shone on his body. It looked as if the light had descended from the sky and enveloped his body. Perfected Lord Tianlan stopped and looked up. His expression was still rather calm. He only frowned slightly as if he was a little surprised but not worried. However, when the blood-colored light shone into the depths of his eyes, the bald perfected lord's body suddenly trembled. Then, a look of confusion slowly appeared on his face. At this moment, a shrill howl suddenly rang out in the darkness of the dry well. Countless ghosts and spirits that had long dissipated appeared again and pounced on perfected Lord Tianlan from all directions. Among the thousands of mournful shadows, one particularly resolute figure charged over with an aura of death, wanting to perish together with this person. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes suddenly seemed to be lit up with two balls of scorching golden flames, as if two suns were rising. At the same time, the blood moon in the sky that had never changed suddenly dimmed a little at this moment. In the next moment, perfected Lord Tianlan's body shone brightly like a blazing sun. He looked down at the weak darkness and pitiful ants in disdain. Majestic and invincible, he spread out in all directions. Chapter 6:14. Lu Qin stood at the entrance of the tunnel, frowning slightly as he looked at the long street in front of him. The number of people on the street had gradually increased, but he still hadn't seen Shui Ying's figure. He raised his head to look at the sky, feeling an inexplicable anxiety in his heart. Right now, perfected Lord Tianlan was alone in the mysterious underground cave. This made Lu Qin feel a rare sense of impatience. He really wanted to turn around and return to the underground cave to see what perfected Lord Tianlan was doing. Of course, he wasn't worried about the damned Baldy's safety. Although it sounded like he was a little unfilial as a disciple, sometimes Lu Qin would be surprised to find that his confidence in his master, who always had complicated emotions, was firmer than most people in this world. There probably wasn't anyone in this world who could assassinate that damned Baldy, right? If there really was such a powerful person, Lu Qin would probably, even applaud in amazement. However, from his previous words and actions, Lu Qin clearly felt that the damned Baldy probably had some secret that he didn't want him to know, so he deliberately sent him away. What was that secret? Was it related to that underground city, or to that mysterious missing bloody man? Lu Qin had thousands of questions in his heart, but he still stood there rationally, waiting for Shui Ying's arrival. The leader of the guards at the cave entrance, Lu Ting, was also standing next to Lu Qin. When he looked at Lu Qin, his eyes were filled with intimacy and gratitude. It was obvious that he was grateful for the kind words that Lu Qin had said in front of Lord Tianlan. After standing with Lu Qin for a long time, he sensed that Lu Qin was a little anxious. After hesitating for a moment, he comforted him. It will take a while for the messenger to reach the mountain from here. He also needs to report to Hall Master Shui. After that, as you said, it will take some time for Hall Master Shui to send 100 people over. Young master, don't be anxious. Wait a little longer. Lu Qin nodded slightly, knowing that Lu Ting was right. In fact, he had deliberately confused Lord Tianlan's intentions when he sent the message just now. According to the damned Baldy's original intention, he probably wanted Shui Ying to come over first, then let Lu Qin personally tell her to send people, and then enter the underground together. All sorts of delays and wasting time would take a long time even with Fuyunji's usual efficiency. Lu Qin didn't believe that perfected Lord Tianlan had said something wrong or that he hadn't thought of these things. Even if everyone in the world went crazy, he felt that the last person left with a clear mind would be the dead Baldy. Therefore, it was obvious that this guy was deliberately delaying so that Lu Qin and Shui Ying would come over later. What was he planning to do alone in the underground city, in that house full of bloodstains? Lu Qin didn't know, but Lu Qin was very anxious. He felt a faint uneasiness in his heart, as if he had missed something important, or something big was about to happen. However, it was as if he was separated by a high wall, unable to see or hear anything. Time was still passing bit by bit. Although Lu Qin's face hadn't reached the point where he would lose his composure in anger, his expression had already become gloomy. Fortunately, at this moment, Lu Ting, who was beside him, suddenly exclaimed in surprise, then pointed to the sky and said, "Young master, Hall Master Shui and the others are here." Shui Ying had indeed come. Just as Lu Qin's rumor had requested, a team of 100 people had come with her. Each of them looked taciturn, but their auras were deep and powerful. Needless to say, they were definitely the most reliable and powerful elite troops in Fuyunji. When this group of people arrived, the guards guarding the tunnel entrance were immediately intimidated. One by one, they retreated, some of them even pressing their backs against the wall. These elites were obviously very experienced. In an instant, several of them surrounded the entrance of the tunnel, guarding the most important throat area. Shui Ying walked in front of Lu Qin and glanced at him. Even though Lu Qin had been on bad terms with her recently, he couldn't help but admire this woman's ability to handle matters. For so many years, she had always been the #1 confidant of Lord Tianlong, and was known as the most powerful woman on Mount Tianlong. There was indeed a reason why she was called the most powerful woman on Mount Tianlong. However, this was obviously not the time to praise, flatter, or get close to him. Lu Chen pulled Shuang to the side and used the simplest words to describe what had happened. In the end, he said, "That's what happened. I'm just passing on Master's words. I'll have to trouble you." Shuang nodded. Her face didn't show any displeasure at being ordered around by Lu Chen. She only said calmly, "You did the right thing. Now that everyone is here, shall we go down now?" Lu Chen had been in a hurry to return to the underground city, but when the time came, he subconsciously hesitated. However, he quickly nodded and said, "All right, follow me." 5 of the elite troops stayed behind to guard the exit, while the rest followed Lu Chen and Shuang into the underground. This caused the expressions of Lu Ting and the other guards to turn ugly. Some of them even looked angry. However, Shuang ignored them, and Lu Chen didn't say anything. He understood what Shuang was thinking. Currently, the 3 most important and powerful people in Fuyunji's faction had all entered a dangerous place, and it just so happened that there was only one exit. Therefore, the importance of guarding this place became obvious. This had nothing to do with trust, it was just a necessary guarantee. Along the way, Lu Chen and Shuang quickly saw the blood moon, as well as the blood-colored moonlight that was everywhere in the underground cave. Just as Lu Chen called out to Shuang and pointed in the direction of the house, he was about to walk in that direction when suddenly, the ground of the underground cave shook violently. This vibration was extremely strong, to the point where even these elites with cultivation were almost thrown off their feet when they were unprepared. The surrounding stone walls and stone domes buzzed, and many shattered stones fell down. In an instant, everyone's expression changed. This scene looked too similar to an earthquake. There was a limit to one's strength. No matter how strong one's cultivation was, if they really encountered a natural disaster, they would be helpless. At that moment, countless people had the thought that the heavens wanted Fuyunji to die. Fortunately, it seemed that the heavens still wanted to give the damned Baldy some face. The shaking only lasted for a while before it calmed down. The falling stones also gradually stopped. While everyone was still in shock, before anyone could say anything, a dazzling beam of light suddenly burst forth from the center of the empty underground city in front of them. It was as if the sun had exploded, forcing back the blood moon's radiance that filled the sky. In the golden light, a figure slowly rose. 100,000 zhang of light enveloped his body, shining brilliantly, as if a real god had descended to the world. It made people worship him. Around Lu Chen, there were people who became excited. However, when he looked at the light in shock, looking at the damned Baldy in the light who was displaying his power like a miracle, he suddenly faintly saw that at the end of the light, behind the glory, a dark shadow flickered in the light. Like a person quietly waving his hand, but also like a desperate struggle, then it dissipated in the brilliant light, turning into nothingness and ashes. Lu Chen stared blankly at the scene in the distance. He was at a loss, but he suddenly felt a pain in his heart. He did not know where it came from. Chapter 6:15. Even though there had been a violent tremor on that day, and nearly 100 people had witnessed the godlike appearance of Supreme Lord Tianlong in the underground city, this news did not spread throughout Zhengxianmeng in the end. This was not an easy task for Zhengxianmeng, which was already like a sieve, because both Supreme Lord Tianlong and Shuang had given the order to keep it a secret after the incident. This also proved that the 100 people that Shuang had brought with her this time were reliable enough, and no one had leaked the news to the outside world. However, although outsiders did not know the specifics of what had happened, it did not mean that no one had noticed anything strange. In the true Immortal Alliance, which was the world's largest Vanity Fair of intrigue, spying on each other and infiltrating each other were common occurrences. Even the guards at the entrance of the tunnel were actually spied on by some unknown people both openly and secretly. Needless to say, Shuang had suddenly gathered her elite subordinates, and there were quite a few of them. This was a huge commotion, and it immediately alarmed many people and forces, causing them to pay attention to this place. After all, Fuyunji was currently the most powerful hall in the limelight, and it was the place that all the major forces valued the most. What was Fuyunji doing? What were they doing underground? Within a day, this question had become the question in the hearts of many forces and leaders in Zhengxianmeng. Probing and investigations regarding this matter had also begun without batting an eyelid. The leader of Zhengxianmeng's Grand Chancellor, True Lord Guangbo, had a somewhat controversial reputation in the world of cultivators for many years. As one of the 6 true lords of Zhengxianmeng, of course, he had a respectable status, and was worthy of the phrase, high position and power. However, for so many years, he had been in charge of Zhengxianmeng's money and power. Rumors of corruption and borrowing money to make money had always been heard, and voices of criticism could often be heard on the streets. True Lord Guangbo had always scoffed at such a phenomenon, and bitterly hated it. He claimed that he had worked his heart out for Zhengxianmeng, used the great hopes of the world to prosper the Raising Immortals Union, supported the weak, rewarded the heroes, and made great contributions to the growth of Zhengxianmeng. He even said that without him, Zhengxianmeng would not have been able to develop to such a strong state today. Not to mention that without his strong financial support, probably Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji would not have been able to completely defeat the remnants of the evil cult. When such a great credit was put on his head, True Lord Guangbo did not feel embarrassed or hesitated at all. At his level, he had everything, so what did it matter to chase after a little fame? But recently, True Lord Guangbo found that he seemed to have thought wrong before. He felt that he did not have enough fame and fortune. The title and reputation of the most powerful person in the world, the most powerful person in the Immortals Union, did not belong to him, but to Tianlan, who always wore a big bald head? There were so many treasures, gold and silver. Didn't it say that the wealth of the major sects in Zhengxianmeng should be managed by the Grand Chancellor? Why did all the major sects, especially Fuyunji, dare to seize so much? They despised the golden rules set by Zhengxianmeng that year. They were all ambitious and treacherous officials. If I don't come out to uphold justice, won't it be like a long night without light? Why does the world look a bit chaotic? Perfected Lord Guangbo suppressed the surging and scorching thoughts in his mind, took a sip of tea, and said to Perfected Lord Guyu. The two of them were drinking tea in a secluded garden behind the starry hall. There was no one in the garden, and True Lord Guangbo had deliberately hidden his tracks and came here quietly. True Lord Guyu looked at him and poured another cup of immortal tea for him, then smiled and said, "Why, Brother Guangbo cares about the world so much. Did you see any injustice again? There are many injustices in the world." Immortal Guangbo said to him bluntly, "Let's talk about the last time we met with old man Tai Hu. I should have been the leader. After all, I was the one who organized everyone to do this big thing, but the two of you pushed me aside. It's really sad." True Lord Guyu nodded with a smile and said, "Speaking of this, I still admire Brother Guangbo very much. It's great that you can look at the big picture." True Lord Guangbo sneered and said, "What big picture? Don't say such things in front of us. The reason why I temporarily endured it that day was because of the look you gave me at the end. Today, I'm here to hear what you have to say about me. If it's really the same old nonsense, don't blame me for turning against you." True Lord Guyu nodded and seemed to have no intention of beating around the bush. He said directly, "Okay, Brother Guangbo is a straightforward person, then I'll be straightforward." He pointed to a direction far away from Mount Tianlong and said, "Let's cut to the chase and speak the truth. Based on the current strength of the Fuyun office and Tianlan, do you, me, Tai Hu, as well as the Golden Dragon and Drifting Cloud clans have the capability to contend against them?" True Lord Guangbo frowned and stared at True Lord Guyu for a moment, then said lightly, "Not a single one, that's it." True Lord Guyu said to True Lord Guangbo, "Now that Fuyunji is powerful and in the limelight, this is the reason why we have to secretly form an alliance to fight against them. If that's the case, when there's a battle in the future, the one who is at the forefront will probably suffer the most, right?" True Lord Guangbo was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, his eyes brightened and said, "You mean to let the old man Tai Hu go to the front to block them?" But then he shook his head and said, the old man Tai Hu is a cunning old man, he won't be fooled so easily. True, Lord Gu said lightly, since he's the leader and wants to get the biggest share of the benefits, I'm afraid it won't be justifiable if he doesn't put in the most effort. If that's the case, we can just say that we're all breaking up. I don't believe that Tai Hu will really give up those things that he has already marked as his territory. Moreover, he smiled and continued, when it really comes to that, everyone will have already turned against each other. Tianlan will definitely know that the leader of our side is Tai Hu. If the situation suddenly changes and we quit, don't you think Tai Hu will panic? Do you think Tai Hu will dare to deal with that lunatic Tianlan alone? Will he have no choice but to try his best to maintain this alliance and put all his assets on the table to fight with all his might? True Lord Guangbo stared at True Lord Guyu for a while and suddenly gasped. He said, good plan. Brother Guyu, I've really underestimated you in the past. True Lord Guyu waved his hand and said, it's just a small trick. You and I are close friends. All these years, the Grand Chancellor has taken good care of the Star Hall. That's why I'm telling you these things. I hope you won't blame me, Brother Guangbo. True Lord Guangbo laughed and said, not at all. We'll do as Brother Guyu says. After that, he pondered for a moment as if he suddenly thought of something. He then said, oh yes, speaking of this, I wonder if you also felt the movement at the foot of Sky Dragon Mountain? It should be caused by Tianlan, right? Chapter 6:16. Guyu was stunned for a moment, then said, I did notice it, but I couldn't immediately determine that it had something to do with Fuyunji. I just felt that it was different from an ordinary earthquake. As he spoke, he glanced at Perfected Lord Guangbo with a complicated look in his eyes. Brother Guangbo, how can you be so sure that it has something to do with Tianlan? Perfected Lord Guangbo said proudly, what's so difficult about that? It's just a trick I set up earlier. Not only did the earthquake have something to do with Tianlan, but I can also determine that it happened at the underground entrance in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City. Someone saw it with their own eyes. Guyu's eyes flickered, but his expression didn't change. He nodded and said, Brother Guangbo, you're really good. I admire you. But since you can determine the location and range, I wonder if Brother Guangbo can tell me what exactly happened. Perfected Lord Guangbo laughed dryly, then shrugged and said, I'm not sure about that. Old man Tianlan sent a group of his most trusted men to watch the underground entrance. Other than his trusted men from Fuyunji, no one else can enter the underground. So until now, we still don't know what he's doing there. Guyu replied with an, oh, and looked thoughtful. Perfected Lord Guangbo looked at him and suddenly smiled. There seemed to be a deeper meaning in his eyes. He said, Brother Guyu, if I remember correctly, that place has been forcefully occupied by Fuyunji and people from other halls are not allowed to enter. But before that, Tianlan seemed to have invited you down and asked you to lead many people from Starry Hall to work in the underground city for a while. Am I right? Guyu frowned and nodded after a while. That's true. Brother Guangbo, what do you want to know? Perfected Lord Guangbo said, other than Fuyunji's people, Brother Guangbo is the one who knows the most about the situation in the underground cave. Brother, please tell me, what secrets are there? And why did Tianlan ask you to go there? What did he ask you to do? He smiled, but there was no joy in his smile. Instead, there was a sense of scrutiny. He said, in addition, do you know what Tianlan did underground? Guyu Perfected Lord pondered for a moment, then said frankly, there is nothing that cannot be said, since Brother Guangbo has asked, I will tell you the truth. The underground cavern is extremely deep and vast, and there's a city hidden there. Although the houses and pavilions are similar to the buildings in the human world, they're much larger in size. It doesn't look like a place where ordinary people live. At this point, Guyu True Monarch's voice gradually became softer, showing signs of hesitation on her face. Perfected Lord Guangbo asked hurriedly, what exactly is it? Did you guys find out? Supreme Guyu shook her head and said, we can't find out, but when I was chatting with Tianlan in the underground city that day, I heard him say that he guessed that it might be the underground city of the demon clan in the past. Devil race. Perfected Lord Guangbo suddenly gasped. Obviously, with his status, he knew some secrets of the past. But soon, his expression returned to normal. Obviously, he thought that this matter shouldn't be a big deal. Otherwise, Tianlan and Guyu wouldn't be so calm. It was probably a well-preserved relic or ruin. Perfected Lord Guangbo thought so, but he didn't take this matter to heart. Perhaps he didn't expect that there were actually some lunatics in this world that he didn't expect. Lunatics or geniuses? Sometimes, it was just a fine line. Perfected Lord Guangbo threw the irrelevant matters of the demon clan to the back of his mind, and asked Guyu True Monarch what he was more concerned about. Why did Tianlan ask you to go underground? Guyu True Monarch said, you know, there is an ancient relic under the immortal city that was sealed by our Zhengxiameng patriarch. After the earthquake a few days ago, the seal was slightly damaged, and it was in the underground cave, so Tianlan asked me to repair it. He smiled and said, you know, our Starry Hall used to do this kind of thing. Perfected Lord Guangbo nodded slowly, agreeing with this statement. After frowning and thinking for a while, he asked again, if that's the case, in Brother Guyu's opinion, what happened underground not long ago? Could it be that Tianlan did something down there? Guyu True Monarch was silent for a moment, then said, I really don't know. You know, there was some discord between me and Tianlan a few days ago. Starry Hall and Floating Cloud also had a dispute, and the Starry Hall disciples who were originally stationed there were also withdrawn. I haven't been there for a long time. Perfected Lord Guangbo replied with a and rolled his eyes. Suddenly, he said, Brother Guyu, I have a presumptuous request. Please don't take offense. Guyu True Monarch's heart skipped a beat, and he said, please say it. Perfected Lord Guangbo said, I still need to trouble you to make a trip down there, in the name of repairing or re-examining the seal, to see what happened underground. With your identity and this excuse, I don't think those people in Fuyunji would dare to stop you. Suddenly, a strange expression flashed across Perfected Lord Guangbo's face, and he looked at Perfected Lord Guangbo. Perfected Lord Guangbo sighed, stood up, and cupped his hands. He said, this is an important matter, and we have to be cautious. Although this matter will affect Brother Guyu's reputation, for the sake of our alliance, please make a trip. It's best if there are no more accidents. Perfected Lord Guangbo stared at him for a long time, and in the end, he suddenly smiled bitterly, and there seemed to be an indescribable expression on his face. In the end, he nodded and said, I understand. Since Brother Guangbo has said so, I won't refuse. I'll make this trip. Perfected Lord Guangbo was overjoyed, and said with a smile, thank you, thank you. After coming out of the underground city, the people in Fuyunji quickly dispersed. After Shuang asked for Perfected Lord Tianlan's instructions, she also left with her people. Although it seemed that they had made a wasted trip, no one had any complaints. Everyone knew that Perfected Lord Tianlan must be doing something extremely important. What kind of big event could it be? No one in Fuyunji, including Shuang, asked any questions. If Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't say anything, it meant that they didn't need to know. After so many years, they were already used to this. However, there was another person in the crowd who wasn't so numb. He was full of doubts and curiosity about what happened when Perfected Lord Tianlan was alone underground. He really wanted to know what had happened. He was Lu Chen. Actually, when he walked into the main hall of Kunlun, Lu Chen also had some doubts. He didn't understand the unusually strong emotional impulse he had this time, but no matter what, he still wanted to ask that damn Baldy what had happened in that light. After all, he and Tianlan came here together, so he felt that he should know something. When he walked into the hall, he saw Perfected Lord Tianlan sitting on his lotus throne, which was rarely seen. Even from such a distance, he could feel that the person on the throne was staring at him with bright eyes, as if waiting for something. Chapter 617. Perfected Lord Tianlan watched as Lu Chen walked in. He did not say anything, nor did he say anything. He just sat quietly on the lotus throne. He wasn't sitting in an upright and dignified manner. Instead, he was sitting in a very casual and comfortable manner. He even put one hand on his knee and supported his chin with his palm. He looked at Lu Chen with a glimmer in his eyes, as if he was hiding some complicated emotions. Lu Chen could not understand what this person was thinking. He only felt that the damn Baldy today seemed to be a little different from usual. Was it because of what happened in the underground cavern? He walked to the lotus throne and stopped. Just as he was thinking about how to ask, he heard Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice coming from the high lotus throne. "Do you have something to say to me?" Lu Chen looked up at the throne uncomfortably. Usually, when they met or were alone, Perfected Lord Tianlan was very close and kind to him. He almost never sat on the high lotus throne to talk to him. He would either stand with him or casually sit on the ground. But this time, with the high lotus throne between them, it was as if there was a chasm between the two of them. They became a little estranged. Lu Chen did not know if Perfected Lord Tianlan did this on purpose or if he was just sitting casually and did not think too much. But this way of speaking still made him feel a little depressed and unhappy. However, when this thought flashed through his mind, Lu Chen was suddenly shocked. At that moment, he suddenly reflected on himself. Given Perfected Lord Tianlan's current power, status, and supreme reputation, he could actually sit on the lotus throne in front of most people in the world. Everyone would also think that it was only right. But why did he feel that it was unfair? It was because for a long time, he had unknowingly gotten used to Perfected Lord Tianlan's special treatment of him. Unknowingly, he had already taken Perfected Lord Tianlan's special treatment for granted. However, if some things were seen through, a cold, naked truth would still be revealed from his dazzling appearance. Up until now, everything Lu Chen had, status, power, wealth, and so on, was actually all because of this man he called Damn Baldy. Without Perfected Lord Tianlan, who would acknowledge a shadow like him? Shuang? Or Fuyunji's arrogant soldiers and valiant generals? He had always prided himself on being calm, but he had unknowingly stepped on the edge of a cliff. Lu Chen stood there quietly. Under his clothes, he was covered in cold sweat. Perfected Lord Tianlan was still sitting on the throne on the high platform. He rested his chin on his hand and stared at Lu Chen. There was no anger on his face, but there seemed to be a playful look in his eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have a unique patience for this disciple of his, which was different from others. But in the depths of his eyes, who would know what he was thinking? Would lightning suddenly descend from the sky? Under his gaze, Lu Chen seemed to be in a trance for a moment when he walked into the hall and stood under the lotus throne, but he soon recovered. He first looked up at Perfected Lord Tianlan and then asked, "Are you all right?" "Me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't seem to expect that Lu Chen would ask such a question, so he was stunned for a moment. Then, he shook his head and laughed. "What could happen to me?" Lu Chen said, "No matter what, you're going there with me. Later, you asked me to call someone. After I left, I didn't know what happened in the underground city. I only saw the scene of you rising at the end. So, I thought that regardless of whether you want to tell me what happened or not, I still have to come and ask if you're all right." Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his eyebrows and was a little surprised, so much so that he fell silent for a moment. Then, his body moved slightly and his unusually tall and burly body suddenly disappeared from the lotus throne. In the next moment, he appeared on the ground like a ghost, standing not far from Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked up at him with a calm expression. However, his hands subconsciously clenched a little tighter under his sleeves. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen for a moment and said with a smile, "I almost thought that I heard wrongly just now. It seems like you're actually showing concern for me. I've never seen you like this before. What's wrong with you today?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "No matter what, I've bowed to you and acknowledged you as my master. You were the one who raised me since I was young. So, after thinking about it these days, I feel that I should be more respectful to you. Ha! Perfected Lord Tianlong seemed to be especially surprised and could not help but laugh. His eyes flickered as he said to Lu Chen with a smile, I'm surprised that you would think that way. I thought that you would only call me a damn baldy in your heart and still have some resentment towards me. Lu Chen fell silent and did not say anything. Perfected Lord Tianlong chuckled. When he realized that he did not get a response from Lu Chen, his expression changed slightly and he quietened down as well. The surrounding atmosphere instantly turned from relaxed to somewhat solemn. He frowned and looked at Lu Chen with some changes in his expression. There seemed to be some joy and some fear. After a while, Lu Chen said slowly, after the Battle of the Barren Valley, I stayed in Qingshidang village for 10 years. I suffered a lot during that time. I'm sure you know how I was, right? Perfected Lord Tianlong replied with a and placed his hands behind his back. He looked at Lu Chen and waited for him to continue. Lu Chen did not make him wait for too long and said with an extremely calm expression, those years were torturous for me and I was hovering between life and death every day. Since I didn't see you coming over, I naturally had some resentment towards you. It's just that after so many years, I gradually understood why you had no choice back then. At this point, he suddenly frowned and stopped talking as a look of displeasure flashed across his face. Perfected Lord Tianlong was listening attentively. He could not help but feel a little surprised when he suddenly stopped and even had a change in expression. What else? Why did you stop? However, Lu Chen seemed to be a little annoyed all of a sudden and turned hostile. No, he rolled his eyes and said angrily while waving his hand, say my A*S. I'm not going to say any more. This is the kind of person I am. You can do whatever you want. In any case, you can do whatever you want. Are you all right? If not, I'm leaving. After being contradicted by Lu Chen, Perfected Lord Tianlong did not know why, but when he looked at Lu Chen's expression, his gaze softened a little as if he recalled the feeling of holding the small hand of the child whom he had just taken away from him many years ago. He smiled as if the entire world had become gentle at this moment. He nodded and was not at all offended by Lu Chen's somewhat angry expression. He said with a smile, I'm fine, I'm fine. He walked over and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. He said with a smile, actually, I just did a small thing down there. I just killed a person. It's not worth mentioning. Lu Chen's body shook and he said in astonishment, killed someone? There's actually someone else in the city down there? Who is it? Perfected Lord Tianlong said indifferently, the remnant of the devil cult called Elder Ghost. As he spoke, he waved his hand as if he was shaking off an annoying dust and did not care at all. Then, he gently put his hand on Lu Chen's shoulder and walked out with his arm around him. At the same time, he said, why do you sound a little surprised about this? Chapter 618. You killed Elder Gui? Even though Lu Chen was usually calm and collected, he couldn't help but be shocked when he heard what Perfected Lord Tianlong said. He turned to look at him in shock. Perfected Lord Tianlong's palm was still on Lu Chen's shoulder. He didn't turn his head and was still looking at the door that was getting brighter and brighter. His eyes narrowed slightly and his smile was warm but deep. He said with a smile, yes. After a pause, he said, why? You sound very surprised. Lu Chen felt a little unaccustomed to Perfected Lord Tianlong putting his hand on his shoulder. In the past, even when he was still a child, Perfected Lord Tianlong had never acted so intimately with him. However, he was not stupid enough to fling that hand away. Perhaps in his heart, he more or less felt a little bit of this person's love for him. However, that palm was warm, thick and wide. Although it wasn't a mountain, it gave people the illusion that a mountain was pressing down on them. It was as if they would be crushed to pieces in the next moment. Lu Chen thought that this was probably because when one's cultivation was too high and his strength was too strong, he would inadvertently give people a strong pressure. Or maybe it was because his habit of being a shadow was too strong. Anyone who got a little closer to him would make him feel threatened. Lu Chen shook his head slightly, shook off the boundless sense of danger in his mind, sighed and said, "We've been chasing that guy for so many years, but we've never caught him. Even though we've basically defeated the remnants of the evil faction in the Immortal City a while ago, he still escaped and became a fish that slipped through the net." He turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "I didn't expect you to actually be able to find and kill him." This time, Perfected Lord Tianlan turned his head and smiled at Lu Chen's expression. There was a glimmer in the depths of his eyes. Then, he nodded and smiled without saying a word. Lu Chen seemed to have thought of something. After pondering for a moment, he suddenly asked, "But did you find him in the underground city? We've searched there many times in the past, but we've never found any trace of him. How did you find him this time?" His expression suddenly changed slightly and he asked in a low voice, "Is it related to the matter with White Lotus?" As they spoke, they had already walked to the entrance of Kunlun's main hall. The sunlight shone down and shone on Perfected Lord Tianlan's face. The warmth seemed to be able to seep into the depths of one's heart. Even the coldest ice would warm up a little. Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps paused for a moment before he withdrew his hand from Lu Chen's shoulder. "Yes." He responded to Lu Chen and then walked out. Atsu was lying on the ground in front of the door of the room that originally belonged to Su Qingjun and now inexplicably belonged to White Lotus. It was snoring loudly. The cold wind in the middle of the night seemed to be unable to blow through the layer of glossy fur on its body and did not affect its sweet dreams at all. Now that the sun had risen and the sunlight had brought warmth, this black dog slept even more soundly. Until one moment, in the room behind it, in the silence that had been maintained for a whole night, a slight sound was suddenly heard. In its sleep, Atsu did not move and did not even open its eyes. However, one of its ears suddenly stood up and trembled slightly. After a while, the sound of intermittent footsteps came from inside the house. However, the person inside the house seemed to be struggling, as if he had suffered a serious injury. Even walking had become difficult. However, from the sound of the footsteps, it seemed that the person in the room was moving slowly towards the door. Atu's eyes snapped wide open. There was no tiredness and laziness in its eyes. Instead, there was a sharp and murderous look in its eyes. As if it felt something, this black dog slowly got up, turned around, and stared at the door as if it was facing a formidable enemy. But soon, Atsu suddenly sniffed again, as if its extremely sensitive sense of smell played a role at this moment, and it smelled something again. This smell was undoubtedly familiar to Atsu. It suddenly became puzzled, and the murderous look on its body faded a lot. There was a hint of doubt in its eyes. The footsteps in the room were still ringing. One step, one stop, one step, one stop, one step, one stop. It seemed to be walking with great difficulty. But even in this strange rhythm, it could still roughly feel that the person in the room seemed to be recovering from a serious illness and was slowly recovering. The pauses between the footsteps became shorter and shorter. Not long after, the person in the room walked behind the door. Now, there was only a thin door between Atsu and the person in the room. Atsu stared at the door. It did not roar, nor did it bark, nor did it have the intention to turn around and leave. For some reason, the situation looked a bit like a confrontation between Atsu and the unknown person. The room became quiet. Perhaps the person in the room felt something, but the door was still closed. The person in the room did not open the door, nor did he have the intention to come out. After a while, the footsteps sounded again, but it gradually left the door and slowly walked to the other side of the room. Then, it gradually faded until the sound completely disappeared, and everything became quiet again. Atu looked at the door quietly, then looked up at the sky. It was unclear whether he was looking at the sky or the warm sun. Then, he lay down on the ground, like a loyal guard, fulfilling his promise from beginning to end. Supreme Tianlan did not tell Lu Chen more about Elder Ghost, including the strange time and place, and the strange way. He did not even mention a word about Lu Chen sending him away. Of course, Lu Chen was not very satisfied with this, but the person standing in front of him was the most powerful person in the world, a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, so he could do and say whatever he wanted, and no one could force him to do so. Although Lu Chen was not convinced, he still accepted this result. Fortunately, his original intention of coming here this time was more or less answered by Supreme Tianlan, so he did not gain nothing. In addition, he seemed to vaguely feel that in this rare master-disciple relationship of theirs, their relationship had probably become a little better. Or in other words, perfected Lord Tianlan would more or less trust him. Lu Chen could not say whether he was happy or sad about this, but he could only accept it. But before leaving, he still found a chance to say to Supreme Tianlan, "By the way, there's something I've wanted to discuss with you for a long time. Let's talk about it by the way today." "Huh?" Supreme Tianlan said, "What is it?" "I'm going to find Supreme Tiehu and help someone pass a message to him." Lu Chen smiled bitterly and said, "I know your relationship is not very good, and the atmosphere in the Immortal Allies is a little subtle recently, so I haven't gone there. I want to see if I can delay it until a good time. But now I feel that it has been delayed for too long, so I want to inform you. Do you think it's convenient?" Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him with a calm expression. "Who are you passing a message for?" "There are not many people in this world who are qualified to pass a message to a perfected cultivator of the deity realm." "Oh, actually, it's not a human, but a wolf," Lu Chen said honestly. Chapter 619. Yes, the heavenly wolf on the great snow mountain was very likely to be the father of the stupid dog of Atsu. The ancient divine beast with a body as huge as a hill had once entrusted Lu Chen to pass a message to a guy named Tiehu after he returned to the central region. Of course, there were not many people named Tiehu in the world. As long as one was not a fool or a moron, he or she would probably know the word taboo. For example, after Baldi became famous all over the world, there would not be many children named Tianlan. On the contrary, if someone had the word Tianlan in their name, in order to avoid trouble, they would often change their name. It might not be a big deal to have the same name as a powerful and unattainable perfected deity of Huashan realm. Therefore, Lu Chen did not need to investigate too carefully to be sure that the person the heavenly wolf wanted to pass the message to must be Immortal Tiehu, one of the 6 perfected deity of Zhengxianmeng. In addition to the above reasons, there was actually another very simple reason. That was, the heavenly wolf was a terrible ancient fierce beast, and the great snow mountain was a dangerous place. How could ordinary people get close to it? After thinking about it, the only possible candidate left was Immortal Tiehu. It had been a long time since Lu Chen returned to the central region from the great snow mountain, including the time when he arrived at the immortal city where the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng was located. During this period, he had seen Immortal Tiehu several times, but almost all of them were in the presence of many outsiders, and most of the time, Immortal Tianlan was also present. As the only successor of Immortal Tianlan, Lu Chen was rapidly integrating into the system of Fuyunji and gradually becoming the kind of person who held power in Zhengxianmeng. At the same time, of course, he could feel the undercurrent surging between Immortal Tianlan and Immortal Tiehu, as well as between Fuyunji and Tianjutsu Hall. Under such circumstances, of course, Lu Chen didn't want to do anything that might be misunderstood by Lord Tianlan. For example, he inexplicably went to meet Immortal Tiehu alone and said something that nobody knew. Perhaps Lord Tianlan wouldn't necessarily suspect him, but this was purely making trouble for himself. Therefore, Lu Chen originally wanted to suppress this matter for a period of time. When the battle between these two big shots calmed down a little, when everyone calmed down and the conflict was not so sensitive, he would find an opportunity to pass on a message. Anyway, Sirius was far away in the great snowy mountain, and there was no time limit when they parted. It should be okay to drag it out for a while. Listening to Lu Chen's narration and explanation, true Lord Tianlan's expression gradually calmed down. He looked at Lu Chen thoughtfully. After a while, he did not see any anger or strange look on his face. Instead, he looked at Lu Chen with interest and said, this matter is nothing. I approve. Go and talk to Tai Hu. But. He shook his big head and asked curiously, I'm a little curious. Your original idea is not wrong. It's okay to wait for a period of time to talk about it. Why did you suddenly change your mind now? After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, I thought for a while just now, and I have a feeling that you probably won't have a good relationship anymore. He sighed and said, I have officially promised Sirius about this matter. Although that guy is not a human, he is more terrible than a human. After thinking about it, I think it's better to end this matter as soon as possible so that I don't have to worry about it. True Lord Tianlan looked at him for a while and suddenly laughed. He nodded and said, Good, end it as soon as possible. All right, you go and talk to him. Lu Chen said and nodded to True Lord Tianlan as a greeting. Then, he was about to leave. However, when he had only taken 2 or 3 steps, True Lord Tianlan's voice suddenly came from behind. Oh yes, what message did Sirius ask you to pass to old man Tai Hu? Can you say it? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. At that moment, a thought flashed through his mind. Logically speaking, the content of a request for a message was naturally more confidential under normal circumstances. However, when Sirius told him about it that day, it didn't seem to specifically say that it was to be kept strictly confidential. Apart from that, the damn Baldy standing in front of him was obviously not an ordinary person. Therefore, Lu Chen quickly understood the situation. He nodded and said, It's not a big deal. You can say it. He paused for a moment and said, Sirius asked me to tell Tai Hu that it's time to return the leaf that I borrowed from him. True Lord Tianlan raised his eyebrows as if he was a little surprised, as if he did not understand what he said. He said with a hint of astonishment, Leaf? But after only a short moment, his face suddenly changed, yet his eyes shone brightly as he suddenly took a step forward and said in a deep voice, You're saying that the devil cult's legendary one of the 4 divine weapons with 2 leaves and 1 seed is in this immortal city Sky Dragon Mountain, and is in the hands of that old man Tai Hu? As he finished speaking, his expression became stern and solemn. It was as if this matter was unexpectedly important to him. Obviously, Lu Chen did not expect that True Lord Tianlan would have such a big reaction after hearing this. For a moment, he was a little stunned and stood rooted to the ground. However, although he looked a little stiff on the surface, in the blink of an eye, his mind was already spinning rapidly like a whirlwind. In an instant, he carefully thought through this matter from the beginning to the end. In fact, when he first heard what Sirius told him, Lu Chen had guessed in his heart that the leaf that Sirius mentioned was very likely to be one of the 4 pieces of the divine tree passed down by the devil's sect. This was because both Sirius and Tai Hu's status were too high. Other than the legendary leaf of the divine tree, he could not think of any other leaf in this world that was worthy for them to specially discuss about debt collection. Of course, as for why the leaf of the devil's sect would be in the hands of Sirius, and why Tai Hu, who was the righteous path's Zhengxiameng and the archenemy of the devil's sect, would actually borrow this leaf, it was an extremely complicated and confusing matter. There might be a big secret in it. But now, to Lu Chen, all this was temporarily not important. What he had to face was True Lord Tianlan's questioning. Therefore, after a moment of hesitation, Lu Chen decided to tell the truth. He said, To be honest, I don't know. When Sirius told me, he did not explicitly say that it was the leaf of the divine tree of the devil's sect. But I guess it is very possible. He took a glance at perfected Lord Tianlan and his heart skipped a beat. Then, he added, Actually, it's also because I have this suspicion. Therefore, before I went to look for perfected Lord Tiehu, I thought about it and decided to tell you first to see what you think. True Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen. After a while, he slowly nodded with a trace of gratification on his face. Then, he looked deeply into the distance. Lu Chen looked over and found that it was in the direction of the Heavenly Law Hall. After a while, he heard True Lord Tianlan said indifferently, You'd better go over and say the same thing to the old man Tai Hu. Also, just say that this matter was kept a secret from Sirius and you did not tell me. Let's see how he reacts. After saying that, he slightly narrowed his eyes, but the corners of his mouth curled into a slightly cold smile. Chapter 620. Lu Chen left the main hall of Kunlun, but he didn't rush to the Heavenly Law Hall immediately. Instead, he went to the house where White Lotus was after thinking for a while. From afar, Lu Chen saw the black dog lying at the door. It seemed that it was still doing its duty after a night of waiting. Lu Chen smiled and walked over to pat its head. Of course, Atsu had already woken up. It stood up when it saw Lu Chen and wagged its tail at him. Although there was a huge difference in size between Atsu and Sirius, in Lu Chen's eyes, he could see that Atsu already had the temperament and outline of Sirius. When Lu Chen thought that Atsu, which had been by his side all these years, might become a terrifying beast that could summon wind and rain and look down on the world like Sirius, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel that it was unreal. If he thought about it this way, perhaps Atsu would not stay by his side for too long. There were always some spiritual beasts in this world that were born with pride. Perhaps they would linger because of their feelings, but they would never succumb and become slaves. Perhaps it would be time for Atsu to leave when it was strong enough. Lu Chen smiled. Although there was a little regret in his heart, he wasn't sad or disappointed. He stretched out his hand and patted Atsu's neck. He said with a smile, "You've worked hard." Atsu looked up at Lu Chen. It seemed to have sensed Lu Chen's feelings. Its eyes were very gentle, and it even took the initiative to rub its head against Lu Chen's arm. At that moment, their minds seemed to be faintly connected. After a while, Lu Chen patted Atsu's head and stood up straight. He turned his gaze to the door behind Atsu. Yesterday, when he left White Lotus here, he did not take good care of White Lotus's injuries. The condition of the girl's body was too strange. Since Supreme Tianlan was unwilling to help, Lu Chen did not have a good idea. He could only use the power of black fire to try to limit and soothe the violent spiritual power. Needless to say, this risky method actually worked in the end. White Lotus's condition was slightly stabilized, but it was still far from a full recovery. It was just that the inexplicable spiritual power in her body seemed to have weakened, and Lu Chen himself didn't know when White Lotus's condition would worsen again. At the very least, he knew in his heart that there was a huge problem with that girl. Perhaps, if this matter really went according to Supreme Tianlan's plan, it would be better for everyone to ignore it and let White Lotus die in silence. Lu Chen shook his head slightly, pushed the door open, and walked in. Behind him, Black Dog looked a little gloomy. It stared at the dark room that Lu Chen walked into. It had one foot in the doorstep, but for some reason, it did not move forward. Just like that, it stood at the door that was neither inside nor outside, as if it was watching or guarding against something. Lu Chen did not notice the strange behavior of Atsu. After he came in, he glanced around the room and soon saw White Lotus lying on the bed. She was covered with a quilt, and her back was facing the wall. It seemed that she had not moved since yesterday. Sure enough, her serious injuries have not recovered? Lu Chen sighed in his heart, and the way he looked at White Lotus was a little complicated. This girl was not close to him, but there were many entanglements between them. With his very tough character, he rarely softened his heart to others, but for some reason, he seemed to see White Lotus in a different light. This kind of feeling actually made Lu Chen feel a little strange. For a time, he even wondered if there was something wrong with his brain to like such a young girl. But later, he quickly realized that his feelings for White Lotus were not the kind of love between a man and a woman, but as for what it was, he did not know. Perhaps, he had always lacked too many emotions. He slowly walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. At the door, Atsu stood on the doorstep, staring at Lu Chen's figure and movements, and seemed to be a little nervous. Lu Chen still did not notice the strange behavior of Atsu. He softly called White Lotus's name, but White Lotus did not move and did not respond. He did not know whether she was asleep or still unconscious. Lu Chen was a little worried, so he reached out his hand to the front of White Lotus's body, and leaned on her white forehead, wanting to see her condition. But at this moment, Atsu suddenly looked up, as if it felt something, and its eyes shone brightly. At the same time, on the delicate and beautiful face of White Lotus, although her eyes were still closed, the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Then, from the shadow under the quilt, a hand suddenly reached out and grabbed Lu Chen's palm. "Hold it tightly." The room instantly became quiet, and there was no sound. The master of Starry Hall, Lord Guyu, was a relatively low-key person in Zhengxiameng most of the time. Of course, that was compared to the other 5 spirit-severing perfected lords. Correspondingly, in order to adapt to his temperament, Starry Hall was usually very peaceful and low-key. Not only did they rarely cause trouble, but when they encountered conflicts, especially with powerful halls, unless they were obviously in the right, Starry Hall would usually give in more times, even when the odds were 50-50. This situation, of course, would be noticed and taken advantage of. But no matter what, the strength of Lord Guyu and Starry Hall could not be ignored, so in most cases, everyone would leave some face. Except for Fuyunji. Fuyunji, this hall was arrogant and despotic, and actually had the same temperament as its founder and leader, Lord Tianlan. Especially in these years, Lord Tianlan's prestige was like the sun in the sky. After defeating the last remnants of the devil cult, it reached a state of insufferably arrogant. The entire hall of Fuyunji, in the immortal city, had reached a state where they could do whatever they wanted and despise all other halls. In the eyes of the people of Fuyunji, this great territory of Zhengxiameng was mostly fought for by Lord Tianlan and Fuyunji. Whether it was the foundation or the prestige, of course, it all belonged to their side. As for the other parasites, they were nothing more than vampires trying to cling on to him. With such a mood, of course, Fuyunji's attitude towards the other halls would not be any better. Of course, no one knew if there was some connivance from the higher-ups of Fuyunji. Not to mention, a few days ago, both Starry Hall and Fuyunji guarded the entrance of the underground city and repaired the underground ruins. But after a small conflict between Lord Tianlan and Lord Guyu, Fuyunji actually chased those people from Starry Hall away. She chased him away without any hesitation. This scene made many people dumbfounded, made many people in Starry Hall angry, and also made many people in Fuyunji secretly feel that it was a little too much. So on this day, when Lord Guyu suddenly appeared at the entrance of the tunnel, the group of guards in Fuyunji all stared with their eyes wide open, at a loss of what to do, and their scalps tingling. This spirit-severing stage lord, could it be that she was here to cause trouble? Under the guesses and worried gazes of the crowd, Lord Guyu walked over expressionlessly, then pointed at the entrance of the tunnel and told the people beside her, "I want to go down and take a look." You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.